Story 1. The Thing in the Closet. It had been 3 days since Jordan moved into the old house on the edge of town, and already he was regretting his decision. The place had been cheap, too cheap, in fact. His friends had warned him there had to be something wrong with it, but Jordan was never one to shy away from a good deal. Plus, he wasn't superstitious. It was just an old house, right? The house was in decent shape, though the floors creaked, and the plumbing groaned like it hadn't been touched in decades. What unsettled him most, though, was the closet in the master bedroom. It was huge, far bigger than any closet he'd ever seen, stretching deep into the wall like a tunnel. At first glance, it seemed like an old storage space, but something about it made Jordan uneasy. The first night was the worst. As Jordan lay in bed, he heard the closet door creak open. At first, he assumed it was just the draft. The house had plenty of them. But when he looked up, he saw that the door wasn't just open. It was slightly ajar, as if someone, or something, had nudged it from the inside. He froze, his eyes glued to the door. The darkness inside the closet seemed thicker than the rest of the room, like a living shadow. His mind raced, conjuring images of things that lurked in the dark, things with sharp teeth and long claws. He shook his head, scolding himself for letting his imagination get the better of him. He got up, crossed the room, and pushed the door shut. Then, just to be sure, he jammed a chair under the doorknob. Satisfied, he crawled back into bed and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. The house groaned, the wind rattled the windows, and every creak and thump sent his heart racing. Then, just as he was finally starting to drift off, he heard it, a soft, scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. His eyes snapped open. The sound was coming from the closet. For a long moment, Jordan lay still, listening. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, like something was scratching at the inside of the door. His skin prickled with fear. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the house settling. Something was in the closet. He stared at the door, the chair still wedged beneath the knob. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. The voice was faint, barely audible, but it chilled him to the bone. "Let me out." Jordan's blood ran cold. He knew he wasn't imagining it. Someone, no, something, was behind the closet door. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly reached for his phone, his hand shaking. But just as his fingers brushed the screen, the scratching stopped. The house fell silent. Jordan held his breath, straining to hear any sound. But there was nothing, only the soft hum of the night. Telling himself it had to be a nightmare, he forced himself to close his eyes. But deep down, he knew it wasn't a dream. The next day, Jordan convinced himself it had been the stress of moving. He went about his day as usual, avoiding the bedroom until nightfall. He didn't mention the closet to anyone, fearing they'd think he was crazy. But as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, the unease returned. That night, the closet door was still shut. Jordan had wedged the chair under the knob again, just in case, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He lay in bed, his eyes locked on the closet. Hours passed in tense silence, and just when he thought he'd finally get some rest, the scratching returned. It started softly, just like before, but this time it was accompanied by a soft thumping, as if something was pressing against the door, trying to push it open. Jordan bolted upright, his pulse racing. "Let me out." The voice was louder now, more distinct, and filled with a malice that made his skin crawl. Jordan didn't move. He couldn't. Fear had paralyzed him, and all he could do was stare at the closet, his mind racing. The door rattled, the thumping growing louder, more frantic. The chair under the knob began to shake, inching across the floor as whatever was inside tried to force its way out. "Let me out." The voice was a growl now, furious and demanding, echoing through the room like a death knell. The door shuddered violently, and Jordan knew. Whatever was in that closet was about to break free. He scrambled out of bed, his hands fumbling for the door to the hallway. He had to get out, had to leave the house. But as he reached for the doorknob, he heard it, a deafening crash. The chair had fallen over. The closet door swung open with a loud, creaking groan. Jordan froze, his hand still on the doorknob. He didn't dare turn around. He didn't want to see what had come out of the closet. But the room had gone deathly quiet, and he knew it was behind him. Slowly, he turned. The closet door was wide open, but the darkness inside wasn't natural. It was thick, suffocating, like a void that swallowed all light. And standing at the edge of that darkness was a figure, tall, gaunt, with long, spindly arms and eyes that gleamed in the dark like burning coals. The thing smiled, its lips pulling back to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It stepped forward, its long fingers reaching out toward him. Jordan screamed, wrenching the door open and stumbling into the hallway. He ran, his heart pounding in his chest as the thing's laughter echoed behind him, low, guttural, and filled with a twisted joy. He fled the house that night, leaving everything behind. He didn't stop running until he was miles away, safe in the bright lights of a crowded diner. He never went back to the house, never told anyone what he had seen. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, he can still hear it, the soft, scraping sound of nails on wood, and the faint whisper that chills him to the bone. Let me out. Story 2. The Voice in the Dark. It started as a dare. When Sarah, Ethan, and Ben decided to spend the night in the woods behind their small town, it was supposed to be a test of bravery, nothing more than a harmless adventure. The woods were dense, and according to local legend, they were haunted. Older kids told stories about strange voices heard in the dark, but no one had ever been brave enough to stay there overnight. Until now, the three friends gathered their gear, a couple of flashlights, sleeping bags, snacks, and set out just as the sun was beginning to set. They joked and laughed as they made their way deeper into the forest, the towering trees casting long shadows across the path. The air grew cooler as the night fell, and soon, the dense canopy of leaves blocked out the sky entirely. It was as if they had entered another world, a world that belonged to the woods. Think we'll see any ghosts? Ben asked, a smirk on his face as he shone his flashlight into the underbrush. Doubt it, Sarah replied, though there was a nervous edge to her voice. She didn't believe in ghosts, but the woods had an unsettling vibe, especially now that the sun had fully disappeared. Ethan, the bravest of the three, shrugged. Maybe, but it's probably just the wind. These stories are just to scare people, right? They found a small clearing and set up camp. As the fire crackled and the marshmallows roasted, the woods around them seemed to press in, the darkness growing thicker by the minute. The sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, the occasional distant animal, filled the air, but soon even those faded away, leaving an eerie silence. It was Ben who first mentioned it. Do you hear that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah and Ethan stopped what they were doing, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of crickets. But then, faint and far off, they heard it, a soft, rhythmic voice. Sarah shivered. It's probably just someone else in the woods. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else out here, and the nearest town was miles away. The voice continued, too soft to make out the words, but there was something about it, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. We should check it out, Ethan said, standing up and grabbing his flashlight. Are you serious? Ben asked, his voice shaky. It's probably some psycho or something. But Ethan was already moving toward the edge of the clearing, his light cutting through the thick shadows. Sarah exchanged a nervous glance with Ben, then stood up to follow. Reluctantly, Ben grabbed his flashlight and joined them. The three of them moved cautiously through the trees, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound as the voice grew louder. It wasn't speaking clearly, just a low murmur, like someone chanting or whispering. The trees seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder, thicker. They came to a stop at the base of a large, ancient tree. The voice was louder now, but still distant, like it was coming from all directions at once. It was low, insistent, and deeply unsettling. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, shining his flashlight around. "It's coming from over there." They followed the sound, pushing deeper into the woods, their flashlights barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The voice was clear now, but still unintelligible. A constant stream of whispers that seemed to wrap around them, pulling them deeper into the heart of the forest. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence was immediate and deafening, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. The three friends stood frozen, their flashlights flickering as the darkness seemed to close in around them. And then they heard it, a voice, clear and distinct, coming from the trees behind them. "Turn around." It was a woman's voice, soft and melodic, but filled with something dark, something dangerous. The words echoed in their heads, chilling them to the core. Ben spun around, his flashlight shaking in his hands. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," Sarah whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to go." But Ethan didn't move. He stood there, staring into the darkness, his face pale. "Ethan," Ben said, nudging him. "Come on, man, let's go." Ethan turned slowly, his face blank, his eyes wide with fear. "She's calling us," he whispered. "What are you talking about?" Sarah snapped, grabbing his arm. "There's no one here. We need to leave." But Ethan shook his head. "She's here. I can feel her." Suddenly, the voice came again, louder this time, closer. "Turn around." This time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, sharp and cutting, impossible to ignore. The three of them spun around, their flashlights flickering wildly as they searched the darkness. And then they saw her, standing at the edge of the clearing, bathed in the faint glow of their flashlights, was a woman. She was tall and pale, her long black hair hanging limp around her face. Her eyes were wide and dark, gleaming with a cold, unnatural light. She wore a tattered, old-fashioned dress, the fabric torn and dirty, as if she had been wandering the woods for years. Her lips parted in a twisted smile. "Come closer." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There was something horribly wrong about the woman, something that made her stomach twist in fear. Her eyes were dead, her skin pale and cracked, and her voice, it was like nails scraping across a chalkboard, a sound that cut straight to her bones. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, backing away slowly. But Ethan didn't move. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "We should go to her." "No." Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Ethan, snap out of it." But it was too late. The woman stepped forward, her smile widening as she beckoned to them, her fingers long and skeletal. "Come closer," she whispered again. Without warning, Ethan broke free from Sarah's grip and started walking toward the woman, his face slack, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Ethan, no!" Sarah screamed, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, drawn toward the woman like a moth to a flame. Ben grabbed Sarah's arm. "We have to go. We can't stay here." But Sarah couldn't move. She watched in horror as Ethan walked straight up to the woman. She reached out to him, her fingers brushing his cheek, and for a moment, Ethan froze, his body trembling. And then, without warning, his body convulsed violently. He let out a horrible, guttural scream as the woman's fingers dug into his skin, pulling him closer. His eyes rolled back in his head, his mouth open in a silent scream, and then, in an instant, he collapsed, his body crumpling to the ground. The woman's smile widened as she stared at Sarah and Ben, her eyes gleaming with hunger. "Run," Ben whispered, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her away. They didn't look back. They ran through the forest, the branches tearing at their clothes, their flashlights flickering as the woman's voice echoed behind them. "Come back, come closer." They burst out of the woods and into the clearing where their campsite still stood. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of town, breathless and terrified. Ethan was never found. The next day, a search party combed through the woods, but there was no sign of him. No body, no tracks. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. Sarah and Ben never spoke about that night. They left town shortly after, unable to bear the memories of what had happened in those dark woods. But they both knew the truth. The woman was still out there, waiting, and every time they closed their eyes, they could hear her voice in the dark. "Come closer." Story 3. The Wrong Road. Jason had been driving for hours, lost on a winding country road that seemed to stretch on forever. The GPS on his phone had lost its signal hours ago, and the road signs, when they even appeared, offered no help. It had been a long day of work, and all he wanted was to get home. But the deeper he drove into the countryside, the more isolated he felt. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for two cars, and the trees loomed tall on either side, their branches tangled like dark, skeletal hands. The sun had long since disappeared, leaving only the cold, inky blackness of night. His car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead, but even that felt inadequate against the suffocating night. Jason cursed under his breath as he checked his phone again. Still no signal. He was utterly alone on this forgotten stretch of road, and there hadn't been a single house or gas station in miles. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a turnoff. It was barely noticeable, hidden behind a cluster of trees, with no sign or marker to indicate where it led. He hesitated, his gut telling him to keep driving. But the thought of wandering aimlessly down the main road for hours pushed him to try it. Maybe it's a shortcut, he thought, trying to reassure himself as he turned the wheel and headed down the narrow dirt road. The road was rough, lined with old, gnarled trees that seemed to close in around him as he drove deeper into the forest. His headlights flickered occasionally, the bumps in the road jostling the car, but he pressed on, hoping it would lead him back to civilization. But as the minutes passed, a strange unease settled over him. The road was too quiet. There were no sounds of animals, no wind rustling through the leaves, only the steady hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath his tires. And there was something else, something off about the road itself. The trees seemed to get denser, the darkness deeper, and the road twisted in ways that made no sense, almost as if it were deliberately winding him into a maze. Jason felt the first prickle of fear. The thought crossed his mind that maybe he should turn back, but the road was so narrow there wasn't enough space to make a U-turn. He'd have to keep driving until he found a wider spot. As he continued down the road, the temperature in the car dropped. He glanced at the dashboard. It was reading far lower than it should have been for a summer night. He turned up the heat, but the cold persisted, seeping into his bones. And then he saw it. Up ahead, just barely visible in the faint glow of his headlights, was a figure standing in the middle of the road. Jason's breath caught in his throat, and he slammed on the brakes, his car skidding to a stop just a few feet from the person. The figure didn't move. Jason squinted, trying to make out any details, but the darkness was too thick. His headlights illuminated only the faintest outline, a tall, thin figure wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothes. The figure's head was tilted slightly to one side, as if it were watching him. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? He honked the horn once, hoping the figure would move aside. But they didn't. They just stood there, motionless. Annoyance replaced his fear for a brief moment, and he rolled down the window slightly, leaning out to shout. "Hey, can you move?" The figure didn't respond. Jason's nerves began to fray. Something about the way the figure was standing, so still, so unnatural, sent a cold wave of dread through him. He considered backing up, but the road behind him was just as narrow and winding, and he couldn't see where he had come from. Then, slowly, the figure began to move, but not in the way Jason expected. The figure didn't step aside, didn't walk. Instead, it glided toward him, as if its feet never touched the ground. Its head remained tilted, its body rigid, as it floated closer to the car. Jason's blood turned to ice. He slammed the car into reverse, his tires spinning on the gravel as he tried to back away, but the figure was faster. It moved with a speed that defied logic, closing the gap between them in seconds. Panic surged through him. Jason hit the gas, but the car barely moved, the wheels struggling to gain traction on the rough road. The figure was right at the hood of the car now, its face just beyond the glow of the headlights. Then it stopped. Jason's heart pounded in his ears as the figure stood still once again, just inches from the car. He could see it more clearly now, a tall, shadowy form, dressed in a long, tattered coat, its face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. But what chilled Jason to the core were its eyes. They weren't human. Where the eyes should have been, there were only dark, empty sockets, hollow and black. And yet, Jason could feel them watching him, staring into his very soul. He screamed, his foot slamming on the gas pedal, and the car shot forward, narrowly missing the figure as it sped down the road. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The road twisted and turned, the trees blurring past as he drove faster and faster, desperate to escape whatever he had seen. But the figure wasn't done with him. As Jason hurtled down the road, the car's engine sputtered. The headlights flickered, and the radio crackled with static. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it again. The figure. It was running alongside the car, its movements unnaturally fast, its long, bony arms outstretched, reaching for him. Its hollow eyes locked onto his, and its mouth, twisted into a grotesque grin, began to move, forming words Jason couldn't hear but could somehow feel in his mind. "You can't escape." Jason's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, his heart racing. He slammed the car into a higher gear, the engine roaring as he pushed it to its limits. The figure fell behind, swallowed by the darkness, but the dread lingered, thick and suffocating. Just when he thought he was free, the road suddenly straightened, and up ahead, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The figure was standing in the middle of the road again, waiting for him. Jason swerved, the car narrowly missing the figure as it careened off the road and into a ditch. The impact jarred him, his head slamming against the steering wheel. Dazed, he tried to start the car again, but it wouldn't turn over. The engine was dead. Breathing heavily, Jason looked around, the dark woods closing in on him. The figure was gone, or so he thought. He heard a soft tapping on the window. Slowly, Jason turned his head. The figure was standing just outside the car, its face inches from the glass, its empty eyes staring into his. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as the figure's twisted grin widened. Jason's breath caught in his throat, and he scrambled to open the door on the other side, desperate to escape. But before he could get out, the door next to him creaked open, and the figure leaned in, its hollow face just inches from his. "You're on the wrong road." The last thing Jason saw before everything went black was the figure's twisted, smiling face, its empty eyes gleaming with malice. When Jason's car was found the next morning, it was abandoned, the doors wide open. There was no sign of Jason anywhere, no footprints, no tracks. The only thing the police found was the car's GPS, glitching and flickering, showing the same message over and over again. No route found. To this day, no one knows what happened to Jason, but the locals in that area warn travelers to stay off the narrow, winding road after dark. They say if you see a turnoff that wasn't there before, don't take it. Because once you're on the wrong road, there's no turning back. Story 4. The Mirror Man. Lily had always been drawn to antiques, and when she found the mirror, she couldn't resist. It stood in the back corner of a dusty little shop on the edge of town, its ornate, gilded frame covered in cobwebs. The shopkeeper had been eager to sell it, offering her an impossibly low price. She didn't question it at the time, too excited by the thought of how perfectly the mirror would fit in her bedroom. She had always loved mirrors, how they could make a room feel larger, how they reflected the light and added elegance. But this mirror was different. From the moment she brought it home, something about it unsettled her. It wasn't the way it looked. The glass was clean, almost too clean, as though it hadn't aged like the frame had. No, it was something else. The way her reflection sometimes seemed wrong, just for a moment. So quick she could almost dismiss it. She would catch her reflection not quite matching her movements. She would turn her head, and for a split second, her reflection would linger, like it was just a beat behind her. She told herself it was just her imagination. Moving stress, she reasoned. She was tired, adjusting to her new apartment, but as the days went on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just when she stood in front of the mirror anymore. She could feel it when she was brushing her hair, or lying in bed, or sitting at her desk. The sense of eyes on her, cold and unblinking. Lily tried to avoid the mirror, but it was nearly impossible. It loomed in the corner of her bedroom, and no matter where she was, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from within the glass. One night, while lying in bed, she woke with a start. The apartment was dark and quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite place. A feeling of presence. Her eyes darted toward the mirror, her heart pounding. She couldn't see her reflection from the bed, but she could see the faint glimmer of the glass in the darkness. Then she heard it. A soft tapping. She sat up, her breath catching in her throat. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate, coming from the direction of the mirror. Tap, tap, tap. Lily swallowed hard. Her eyes locked on the mirror's surface. She wanted to turn on the light, to banish the dark thoughts that were racing through her mind, but she couldn't bring herself to move. And then she saw it. A shadow, a figure, just barely visible in the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through her window. It was in the mirror, standing just behind her reflection. Lily's blood ran cold. She wasn't standing in front of the mirror. She was in bed, and there was no one else in the apartment. Slowly, the figure in the mirror began to move, stepping closer to where her reflection should have been. It was tall, much taller than she was, and its movements were smooth, almost unnatural. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as the figure raised a long, thin hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Lily couldn't breathe. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure's face began to emerge from the shadows, and she realized with a sinking dread that it had no features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, blank face staring back at her from within the mirror. And then it spoke, or rather, something spoke. A voice, low and hollow, filled the room, though its mouth never moved. It came from everywhere and nowhere, as if the walls themselves were whispering. "Let me out." Lily's breath caught in her throat. Her body trembled as the figure's hand pressed harder against the glass, and cracks began to form in the mirror's surface. She could see the glass splintering, thin lines spiderwebbing outward from where the figure's hand rested. "Let me out." The voice was louder now, more insistent. The cracks spread, pieces of the glass beginning to fall away. Lily scrambled out of bed, her hands shaking as she fumbled to turn on the light. When the room flooded with brightness, the mirror seemed to shimmer, the figure inside growing dimmer, fainter. The cracks remained, but the figure was no longer visible, though she could still feel its presence lurking just beyond the glass. She stood there, breathless and trembling, staring at the mirror, half expecting the figure to reappear. But the room remained quiet, the only sound her ragged breathing. She didn't sleep that night. The mirror remained in the corner, cracked and broken, but she couldn't bring herself to get rid of it. Something about it seemed too dangerous, too alive. The next day, she decided to cover the mirror. She grabbed an old sheet and draped it over the glass, blocking the reflection entirely. It made her feel safer, though deep down, she knew the figure was still there, lurking behind the cracks. For a few nights, things were quiet. The tapping stopped, and the oppressive sense of being watched seemed to ease. Lily thought she had finally put the nightmare behind her. But one night, as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes snapped open. The sheet was still covering the mirror, but the tapping was unmistakable. "Let me out." The voice was closer this time, more distinct. It didn't seem to be coming from the mirror anymore. It was in the room with her. Lily bolted upright, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was dark, the shadows thick and heavy, and she could feel the presence again, stronger than ever. Slowly, she turned toward the covered mirror. The sheet was moving. Something was pushing against it from the inside, the fabric stretching and bulging as if something was trying to break through. "Let me out." Lily couldn't take it anymore. She jumped out of bed and ran for the door, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But just as she reached for the doorknob, she heard it, a soft, low creak. She turned, her heart stopping. The sheet had fallen to the floor, and the mirror was empty. Her reflection was gone. Instead, the glass was filled with darkness, deep and infinite. The cracks had grown wider, and through them, she could see something moving on the other side. Something was crawling out. The figure's long, thin arms reached through the cracks, its smooth, featureless face slowly emerging from the darkness. It pulled itself through the shattered glass, its body unfolding in long, jerky movements as it stepped into the room. Lily backed away, her mind racing. She had to get out. She had to. The figure was faster. In one swift, unnatural movement, it was in front of her, its blank face inches from hers. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The cold, dark presence of the mirror man enveloped her, and the last thing she heard before the world went black was his voice, whispering in her ear. "Now it's your turn." When Lily's friends came to check on her the next day, the apartment was empty. Her phone was still on the bedside table, her keys on the kitchen counter, but there was no sign of her anywhere. The mirror in the corner of her bedroom stood untouched, though the glass was no longer cracked. It was smooth, pristine, and reflected the room perfectly. But if you looked closely, just beyond the glass, you could see something dark and shadowy moving in the depths of the mirror. And sometimes, if the room was very quiet, you could hear it. Tap, tap, tap. The mirror man was still waiting. Story 5. The Faceless Ones. It was the middle of summer, but for some reason, the air felt unusually cold as Kayla stepped off the train at the old station. The town of Eldridge was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the place had been abandoned years ago. Her grandmother had passed away recently, and Kayla had come to settle her affairs, staying in the old family house that had been left to her. It had been years since she'd last visited, but she remembered the town being much more lively back then. Now, everything seemed different. The streets were empty, the shops closed, and the sky was overcast, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. As she made her way through town, dragging her suitcase behind her, Kayla couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around, but there was no one there. Just the wind, whispering through the trees. The family house was located at the edge of town, standing at the end of a long dirt road that led into the woods. It was an old, sprawling Victorian, with ivy creeping up the walls and windows that seemed to peer down at her like eyes. She pushed open the creaky front gate and made her way up the stone steps to the front door. Inside, the house was just as she remembered, dark, musty, and filled with the smell of aged wood and dust. Her grandmother had always kept it in perfect condition, but in the years since her last visit, it had begun to decay. Furniture was covered in white sheets, cobwebs draped across the corners, and the air was thick with the weight of the past. Kayla set her suitcase down and wandered through the house, memories of her childhood flooding back. But the more she explored, the more something felt off. The house didn't feel quite right. There was a strange stillness to it, as if something was missing. The quiet was suffocating, the kind that presses down on you, amplifying every creak and every whisper of the wind. As the sun began to set, Kayla decided to go through some of her grandmother's old belongings, hoping to find some closure. She made her way to the attic, where most of the family's history was stored, old photos, letters, and keepsakes tucked away in dusty boxes. The attic was even colder than the rest of the house. The single, dusty window let in a faint glow, casting long shadows across the floor. Kayla opened the first box she found, rummaging through yellowed papers and faded photographs. That's when she noticed something strange. The photos, at first glance, they were just old family pictures. Her grandmother, her grandfather, even her parents as children. But as Kayla looked closer, a chill ran down her spine. None of the people in the photos had faces. Their bodies were there, their clothes, their surroundings. But where their faces should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless blur, as if someone had smudged the images beyond recognition. Kayla stared in disbelief, her hands trembling as she rifled through more photos. Every single one was the same. Faceless figures standing in front of old houses, in front of cars, or gathered around dinner tables. People who had once been full of life, now reduced to featureless shadows. Her pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat. She had never seen these photos before. They had never been like this. She slammed the box shut, her heart racing. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Suddenly, a noise from downstairs broke the silence. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps. Kayla froze. She was certain she had locked the front door. No one should be inside the house but her. She strained to listen, her heart pounding in her ears. The footsteps grew louder, slow and deliberate, moving through the house, closer and closer. Swallowing her fear, Kayla crept toward the attic stairs, peering down into the dark hallway below. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then she heard it, a low, raspy breathing, coming from the bottom of the stairs. The kind of breathing that didn't belong to anyone she knew. It was too slow, too strained, as though it took effort to pull in each breath. Kayla's blood turned to ice as a figure stepped into view. It stood at the bottom of the attic stairs, tall and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The shadows hid its features, but even from where she stood, Kayla knew it wasn't human. The figure's head turned toward her, and for a brief, horrifying moment, she caught a glimpse of its face. Or rather, the lack of one. Like the people in the photographs, the figure had no face. Only a smooth, featureless expanse of skin where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. But despite this, Kayla could feel it watching her, feel its gaze burning into her. Her heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen in place as the figure began to climb the stairs, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the fear it was creating. Kayla backed away, her mind racing. She had to get out, had to escape before it reached her. But the attic door was the only way out, and the figure was blocking the stairs. The faceless figure reached the top of the stairs, its head tilting even farther to the side as it stepped into the attic. Kayla could hear the rasping breath, could feel the cold air radiating from its body as it drew closer. And then it spoke, a low, garbled whisper, like a voice coming from deep underwater. The words were impossible to understand, but the tone was unmistakable, cold, mocking, full of malice. Kayla's hands fumbled behind her, searching for something, anything to defend herself with. Her fingers brushed against a small, heavy box, and she grabbed it, hurling it at the figure with all her strength. The box hit the figure square in the chest, and for a moment, it stopped. But then, it began to change. The figure's body twisted and contorted, its limbs bending at impossible angles, as though it were trying to pull itself into something even more grotesque. The featureless face began to shift, forming vague impressions of eyes and a mouth, twisted, cruel, as though it were trying to form a human shape but failing. It let out a low, gurgling laugh, and the sound sent a jolt of terror through Kayla. She had to get out. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. Without thinking, she turned and ran toward the window, throwing it open and climbing out onto the roof. The cold air hit her face as she scrambled down the side of the house, her hands slipping on the wet shingles. Behind her, she could hear the thing moving, its twisted limbs scraping against the attic floor. She hit the ground hard, pain shooting through her ankle, but she didn't stop. She limped toward the woods, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind racing. She didn't know where she was going. She just had to get away from the house, away from whatever that thing was. As she disappeared into the trees, she glanced back at the house one last time. The figure was standing in the window, watching her, its head tilted, its featureless face smiling. The next day, when the police arrived, they found the house empty. Kayla was gone, and there was no sign of any intruders. The only thing they found was a box of old photographs, each one showing faceless people, their identities lost to time. But if you look closely, at the very back of the box, there is a new photo. It shows the house, and standing in front of it, frozen in time, is Kayla. Her face is gone. Story 6. The Whispering Field. On the outskirts of town, beyond the hills and down a narrow dirt path, there was a field. Not many people went there anymore, mostly because of the stories. The locals called it the Whispering Field, though no one seemed to remember how it got its name. People just knew that the field was a place you didn't go after dark. Those who did never came back the same. Some didn't come back at all. Emma had heard the stories her entire life. As a kid, they had scared her, but as she grew older, she dismissed them as local legends meant to keep kids from wandering too far. Ghost stories, nothing more. But when her friend Tom dared her to visit the field one night, she hesitated. Tom was a skeptic, always mocking the stories, and he'd been teasing her about her hesitation for days. "It's just a field," he'd say, laughing. "You really believe in all that whispering nonsense?" She didn't, or at least she didn't think she did. And that's how, on a cold autumn night, Emma found herself standing at the edge of the whispering field, the tall grass swaying in the breeze. Tom was with her, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as they ventured deeper into the field. The full moon hung overhead, casting long shadows across the grass. "See? Nothing," Tom said, his voice cocky, though there was a hint of unease beneath his bravado. "No ghosts, no whispers. Just a creepy old field." Emma didn't respond. There was something about the air, something heavy. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind, which had been blowing steadily moments before, seemed to have stopped. The field was still, the tall grass like dark fingers reaching toward the sky. As they walked further in, Emma began to feel it, a pressure, almost like they were being watched. She turned around, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the field, but there was no one there. Just the endless expanse of grass. "Tom, I think we should go back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom laughed, but it was forced. "Come on, we just got here." You're not seriously scared, are you? But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence was oppressive, and the further they walked, the more the air seemed to thicken, like the field was swallowing them whole. And then they heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, carried on the still air. It was soft, like a distant voice calling to them from deep within the field. Emma froze, her blood running cold. Tom stopped too, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkness. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Emma nodded, her heart racing. "It's just the wind, right?" But there was no wind. The whisper came again, louder this time, though still distant. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a call, a beckoning, something urging them to come closer. "Let's go back," Emma whispered, gripping Tom's arm. He didn't argue this time. They turned around, but the moment they did, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if something was chasing them through the grass. The air was thick with the sound now, multiple voices, overlapping, whispering words they couldn't understand. They sounded ancient, broken, like the voices had been trapped for centuries. They began to run, their footsteps thudding through the field, the whispers growing louder with every step. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest as the darkness pressed in around them. "Come on," Tom shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the whispers. Emma felt the weight of the voices pressing down on her, pulling at her, trying to drag her back into the field. She could barely see the edge now. The darkness had swallowed everything, and the moon seemed dimmer, as though the field itself was draining the light from the sky. Then, without warning, Tom stopped. Emma nearly collided with him, grabbing his arm in panic. "What are you doing? We have to keep going." But Tom didn't respond. He stood perfectly still, his eyes wide, staring ahead as though he'd seen something she couldn't. "Tom!" Emma's voice was shaking. She pulled on his arm, but he wouldn't move. And then she heard it, a new whisper, closer this time, so close it seemed to come from right next to her ear. "Don't go." Emma's blood turned to ice. She spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers were everywhere now, surrounding them, filling the air with their insistent, maddening murmur. "Tom!" she screamed, shaking him harder. But when he turned to face her, his eyes were blank, glassy, as though he were looking straight through her. "We can't leave," he said, his voice hollow, distant. "They won't let us." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the pressure building, the whispers growing louder, more demanding, as though the field itself was trying to consume them. "I'm not staying here," she shouted, her voice shaking with fear. She grabbed Tom's hand and yanked him forward, trying to pull him out of his trance. But he resisted, his body stiff, unyielding. "It's too late," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the roar of the whispers. "We're part of it now." Emma's pulse raced. She wasn't going to die here. She wasn't going to let the whispers take her. With a surge of strength, she tore herself away from Tom, sprinting toward the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the field. Behind her, she could hear the whispers growing frantic, like they knew she was escaping. The voices overlapped, angry and desperate, calling her name, pleading with her to come back. But she didn't stop. She didn't dare look back. She burst through the edge of the field, her legs shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees loomed ahead of her, dark and towering, but they felt safe, safer than the field. She collapsed to the ground, her heart pounding in her chest, the whispers fading as she left the cursed place behind. For a moment, the silence was deafening. The air was cold and still, but the whispers were gone, and so was Tom. She looked back toward the field, but all she could see was the tall grass swaying gently in the breeze. There was no sign of him, no sign of anyone. The field was empty. The next day, search parties combed through the whispering field, but they found no trace of Tom. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, swallowed by the very ground itself. The townspeople whispered about the field, as they always had. Some said it was cursed, that the land was haunted by the souls of those who had disappeared over the years, their voices forever trapped in the wind. Emma left town the next day, unable to stay in the place where she had lost her friend. But the whispers followed her, haunting her dreams, filling her mind with their endless call. And late at night, when the world was quiet and still, she could still hear them, the voices, faint and distant, calling to her from the whispering field. They were waiting. Story 7. The Drowned Ones. There's a lake at the edge of town, nestled deep within the woods, known to the locals as Blackwater Lake. For as long as anyone could remember, there had been stories about the lake. Stories of people who wandered too close, lured by the still waters, only to vanish without a trace. The lake was said to be cursed, its waters hiding something dark, something no one could ever fully explain. The legends varied, but they all had one thing in common: the drowned ones. It was said that the lake had claimed countless victims over the years, pulling them into its depths, never to be seen again. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the fog rolled in thick and heavy, you could hear their voices calling from beneath the surface, begging for release. Mia had grown up hearing these stories, but like most people her age, she didn't believe in them. They were just tales to scare kids away from the lake, passed down through generations of superstitious locals. That didn't stop her from feeling a chill run down her spine every time she walked past Blackwater Lake. There was something about the water, how still it always seemed, how it never reflected the light quite right, that made her uneasy. But she would never admit that to anyone, least of all her friends. So when her best friend, Jenny, suggested they spend the night by the lake as a way to prove there was nothing to be afraid of, Mia reluctantly agreed. It was supposed to be a fun night, just a group of friends hanging out by the water, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. Nothing more. The night was cold and foggy, the air thick with the smell of damp earth as Mia, Jenny, and their friends hiked down to the shore of the lake. The moon was full, but its light barely pierced the dense mist that clung to the water's surface, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. They set up camp close to the shore, the flickering fire casting long shadows across the trees. Laughter filled the air as they joked and told stories, their voices echoing in the stillness. But as the night wore on, the conversation began to drift toward the legend of the drowned ones. "You don't really believe in that, do you?" Jenny asked, tossing another log onto the fire. Mia shrugged, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's just a story. There's no such thing as cursed lakes or ghosts." "But people have disappeared here," their friend Mark chimed in, his face half hidden in the shadows. "I mean, even if it's not ghosts, something's not right about this place." Jenny rolled her eyes. "It's probably just accidents. People drown all the time, especially in lakes this big." "Still," Mia said softly, glancing out at the water. The surface was unnervingly calm, the mist swirling above it like fingers reaching out to them. "There's something off about it." The group fell silent for a moment, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the stillness. Then, from the direction of the lake, came a soft sound. A ripple in the quiet, a faint splash, like something breaking the surface of the water. Mia froze, her heart skipping a beat. She looked at Jenny, but her friend didn't seem to have noticed. The others continued talking, their voices oblivious to the strange sound. Another splash. This time, it was louder. Mia turned toward the lake, her eyes straining to see through the thick fog. The water remained still, but she could feel it. Something was out there. Something was watching them. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Jenny frowned, glancing at her. "Hear what?" "From the lake. I think there's something out there." Mark laughed, though there was a nervous edge to it. "Come on, Mia, don't start. It's probably just a fish." But Mia wasn't so sure. The sound wasn't natural. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. It reminded her of footsteps, soft, slow, as if someone were walking through the water, coming closer with every step. Suddenly, a voice cut through the fog. It was faint, almost drowned by the sound of the fire, but Mia heard it. It was a woman's voice, and it was calling her name. Mia. Her blood ran cold. She looked around, but no one else seemed to hear it. Jenny and the others were still talking, laughing, oblivious to the voice that whispered from the water. "Mia." The voice was closer now, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the shore. It was coming from the lake. Mia stood up, her pulse racing. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to get away from the water, to run. But something else pulled at her, something stronger than fear. The voice, it sounded familiar. Without thinking, Mia started toward the water's edge, her footsteps soft against the damp ground. "Mia, what are you doing?" Jenny called after her, but Mia didn't respond. She couldn't. The voice was all she could hear now, calling to her, pulling her closer. The fog thickened as she neared the water, the air growing colder with every step. The surface of the lake was perfectly still, a black mirror reflecting the swirling mist. "Mia." The voice was right in front of her now, just beyond the edge of the shore. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat as she stared out into the fog. And then she saw it, a figure, standing just beneath the surface of the water. A woman, her hair floating around her like dark seaweed, her eyes wide and lifeless. Her mouth was moving, forming the words that Mia had heard, but no sound came from her lips. Mia couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the woman's face. There was something wrong with her. Her skin was pale, too pale, and her arms were unnaturally long, her fingers stretching out beneath the water like twisted branches. "Mia, come back," Jenny shouted, her voice distant, as if it were coming from far away. But Mia couldn't turn back. The woman in the water was still staring at her, her mouth moving faster now, though Mia couldn't make out the words. And then, slowly, the woman began to rise from the water, her body lifting out of the lake without making a sound. Mia's breath caught in her throat as the woman emerged fully from the water. Her body was bloated, her clothes tattered and clinging to her decaying skin. But it was her eyes, those cold, dead eyes, that held Mia in place, freezing her where she stood. "Mia." The woman's voice was in her head now, echoing through her mind like a chorus of whispers. Mia felt a sharp pain in her chest, her lungs tightening as if the very air had been sucked out of her body. Suddenly, a hand shot out from beneath the water, grabbing Mia's ankle with a cold, iron grip. She gasped, stumbling backward, but the hand pulled her down, dragging her toward the lake. She screamed, thrashing against the invisible force that was pulling her closer to the water. But it was no use. The hand tightened its grip, and she could feel more fingers wrapping around her, cold and wet, pulling her under. "Mia." Jenny's voice was faint, barely audible over the roar in Mia's head. The last thing Mia saw before she was pulled under was the woman's face, smiling with a twisted, cruel grin. Then the water swallowed her whole. The next morning, the police found the campsite abandoned. The fire had long since burned out, and there was no sign of the four friends who had gone to the lake the night before. The locals didn't need to ask what had happened. They knew. Blackwater Lake had claimed more souls. And on foggy nights, when the mist rolls in thick and heavy, they say you can still hear their voices, the drowned ones, whispering from beneath the surface, calling for someone to join them in the cold, dark depths. If you listen closely, you might even hear your own name. Story 8. The Eyes in the Woods. The small town of Red Pines was surrounded by miles of dense forest, dark and silent at night. The townspeople were proud of the towering trees and endless trails, but there were places within the forest no one dared to venture, especially not after sundown. In particular, there was one patch of woods the locals avoided, an area they called the Hollow. The trees in the hollow grew close together, their branches twisted and gnarled, creating a canopy so thick that no sunlight ever seemed to reach the ground. The air there always felt heavy, and there were whispers, stories told in hushed voices around campfires, about people who went into the hollow and never came out. But those were just stories. At least, that's what Logan and his friends told themselves when they decided to camp in the hollow. They had spent the summer hiking and camping in every corner of the woods, and with their final week of vacation approaching, they wanted one last adventure before school started. The hollow seemed like the perfect challenge. None of them believed the old legends, but the thrill of testing their courage made it irresistible. That's how Logan, Max, and Chloe found themselves standing at the edge of the hollow late one afternoon, staring into the shadowy forest. The trees loomed over them, and the path ahead was barely visible, choked by roots and undergrowth. "Looks creepy, huh?" Max joked, though his voice was strained. Chloe rolled her eyes. "It's just a bunch of old trees. What's the worst that could happen?" Logan, the most level-headed of the group, nodded in agreement. "Exactly. We'll set up camp, tell some stories, and prove there's nothing to be afraid of." They hiked into the hollow, the sunlight quickly fading as the trees closed in overhead. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the air growing colder and more oppressive. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the wind in the trees, faded, replaced by an eerie silence that made Logan's skin prickle. By the time they found a clearing big enough to set up camp, the sun had all but disappeared, and the trees around them seemed to press in from every direction. They built a fire, but the flames barely seemed to chase away the darkness. The shadows flickered, long and shifting, making it impossible to see beyond the circle of light. "All right," Chloe said, sitting down next to the fire. "Who's going to start the ghost stories?" Max grinned. "I've got one. Have you heard the story of the eyes?" Logan and Chloe exchanged glances. They hadn't heard of this one. Max leaned in, lowering his voice. "It's an old legend from around here. Supposedly, if you walk into the deep woods at night, you'll start to feel like something's watching you. And if you look closely, you might catch a glimpse of it. Just a pair of glowing eyes staring at you from the trees." "That's it? Just eyes?" Chloe asked, unimpressed. Max smirked. "Not just any eyes. They say that if you see them, it means it's already too late. The eyes belong to something that lives in the woods, something ancient, something that hunts at night. Once it's spotted you, it doesn't matter how fast you run. It will follow you, watching, waiting, until it catches you." "And what happens then?" Logan asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Max leaned back, his grin fading. "You disappear, just like the people who went into the hollow and never came out." Chloe snorted. "That's so lame." Logan chuckled, though the unease creeping up his spine wouldn't go away. It was just a story, but the darkness around them felt thicker than before, the silence heavier. They spent the next hour laughing, roasting marshmallows, and trying to shake the eerie feeling that had settled over their camp. But as the fire began to die down, so did their laughter. The forest felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting. "Do you hear that?" Logan asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Chloe and Max stopped talking, listening intently. There was nothing. No wind, no rustling leaves. Just silence. "Probably the wind," Chloe muttered, though her voice was quieter now. But Logan wasn't so sure. The air was completely still, and yet there was a faint sensation of movement, like something was shifting in the darkness just beyond the firelight. Max stood up, stretching. "I'm gonna take a leak. Be right back." He grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the edge of the clearing, disappearing into the trees. Chloe rolled her eyes. Why does he always pick the creepiest times to wander off? Logan didn't respond. His attention was fixed on the tree line, his pulse quickening as a cold breeze suddenly swept through the clearing. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, something reflecting the light of the fire. He thought it might be Max's flashlight, but it wasn't. Two glowing orbs, low to the ground, were shining from the darkness between the trees. Eyes. Chloe, Logan whispered, his voice barely audible. Look. Chloe turned toward the trees, her face paling as she spotted the eyes. They weren't human. They were too bright, too large, and they didn't blink. They just stared at them, unmoving. What is that? Chloe stammered, her bravado gone. I don't know, Logan replied, his heart pounding in his chest. But it's watching us. They both stood, their eyes locked on the glowing orbs. The eyes didn't move, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like the weight of the entire forest had shifted onto them. Max, Chloe called out, her voice shaking. Max, come back? There was no response. The silence stretched on, and the eyes remained fixed on them, unblinking. Logan, Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. Where's Max? Before Logan could answer, the eyes suddenly moved. They darted to the left, disappearing behind a tree, only to reappear a moment later, closer than before. Logan, what the hell is that? Chloe's voice was rising in panic now. The eyes moved again, faster this time, circling them, always staying just beyond the light of the fire. And then, from the darkness, they heard it, Max's voice. Guys, where are you? Logan spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Max, we're over here. But Chloe grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. Logan, that's not him. The voice came again, closer this time. Guys, I can't find you. Logan's stomach twisted. Chloe was right. The voice sounded like Max, but there was something off about it. It was too flat, too emotionless. And it was coming from the direction of the eyes. Max? Logan called out, though his voice trembled. Is that you? Silence. And then, from the darkness, the voice answered. Come closer. Logan's blood ran cold. The voice was wrong, twisted, distorted, like it was mimicking Max but couldn't quite get it right. The eyes moved again, circling faster now, darting between the trees, as if they were trying to surround them. Logan, we need to go. Now. Chloe's grip tightened on his arm, but Logan couldn't move. His eyes were locked on the glowing orbs, his mind racing. Where was Max? What was watching them from the darkness? The voice came again, louder this time, closer. Come closer. And then, the eyes blinked out. For a moment, the forest was silent again. The fire crackled weakly, the darkness closing in around them. And then, from behind them, came the soft rustling of leaves. Logan and Chloe spun around, their breath catching in their throats. Standing at the edge of the firelight was Max, but something was wrong. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking, and his clothes were soaking wet, as though he had just crawled out of a river. His mouth hung open slightly, but no sound came out. Max? Chloe whispered, taking a step toward him. But Logan grabbed her arm, pulling her back. That's not him. Max, or whatever was standing there, took a slow, deliberate step forward, its eyes fixed on them. And as it moved, Logan realized with a jolt of terror that it wasn't walking. It was gliding. Run! Logan shouted, grabbing Chloe's hand and yanking her toward the trail. They sprinted through the trees, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the still night. Behind them, they could hear the rustling of leaves, the soft patter of something moving too quickly, too smoothly, through the forest. The voice followed them, echoing through the woods, distorted and hollow. Come closer, come closer. But they didn't stop. They ran until their legs burned, until the trees thinned and the lights of the town appeared in the distance. When they finally made it back, breathless and terrified, Max was never found. The townspeople searched the woods for days, but there was no trace of him. No footprints, no clothing, nothing. The hollow had claimed another. And on quiet nights, if you stand at the edge of the forest and listen closely, you can still hear the whispers. The eyes are always watching, waiting for the next person to wander too close. Story 9. The Silent Stalker. The first time Lisa noticed the man, it was nothing more than a fleeting glance. She had been walking home from work late at night, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets, when she caught sight of him out of the corner of her eye. Just a shadowy figure standing beneath a street lamp, watching her. She had brushed it off. It was a city, after all. People were everywhere, even late at night. She hadn't thought anything of it, chalking it up to her imagination or a passerby on his way somewhere else. But the next night, he was there again. Same place, same street lamp, his figure barely visible in the dim light. He stood motionless, just watching her as she passed by. A chill ran down her spine, but Lisa told herself not to be paranoid. She quickened her pace, pulling her jacket tighter around her as she hurried home. By the third night, Lisa couldn't ignore it anymore. He was there, again, standing beneath the same street lamp, his face hidden in shadow. He never moved, never approached her. But there was something about his presence that made her skin crawl, something that filled her with a growing sense of dread. When she mentioned it to her friends, they shrugged it off. "It's probably just some guy waiting for a bus," they said. "You're overthinking it." But Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something wrong. She started avoiding that particular street on her way home, taking detours through busier areas, hoping to shake the feeling that she was being watched. For a few nights, it worked. She didn't see him, and she began to feel silly for having been so scared. Maybe her friends were right. Maybe it had just been her imagination. But then, one night, as she was heading home through a different street, she saw him again. He was standing at the end of the block, half hidden in the shadows of a tall building. His posture was the same, rigid, motionless, his face obscured by the darkness. But this time, there was no mistaking it. He was watching her. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing through the empty street as she tried to put as much distance between herself and the man as possible. She didn't dare look back. She just kept walking, her breath coming faster with every step. By the time she reached her apartment, she was shaking. She locked the door behind her, double-checking it before pulling the blinds closed. She sat on the couch, her pulse still racing, trying to calm herself down. But even in the safety of her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, somewhere, watching her. That night, Lisa barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside her window made her heart race. She got up several times, checking the locks, peering through the blinds, but there was no one there. The street below was empty. The next morning, Lisa decided she had to take action. She went to the police, explaining the situation, describing the man who had been following her. But without any concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. "Just be careful," the officer had said. "If you see him again, call us immediately." Lisa nodded, but deep down, she knew they wouldn't come in time. Whoever this man was, he was patient. He wasn't going to do anything while there were witnesses. He was waiting for the right moment. Days passed, and Lisa tried to go about her life as normally as possible. But the man's presence weighed on her like a shadow, always lurking at the edge of her thoughts. She couldn't relax, couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting. Then, one night, she saw him again. It was late, and she had just gotten off work, her feet aching as she made her way home. The streets were quieter than usual, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. She had been avoiding her usual routes, taking different streets every night to throw him off, but it hadn't worked. As she rounded a corner, there he was, standing at the far end of the street, his face hidden beneath a dark hood, his body silhouetted against the faint glow of a streetlight. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She froze for a moment, panic rising in her chest, before she turned and bolted in the opposite direction. Her feet pounded against the pavement as she ran, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She didn't look back, but she could feel him, his presence like a cold hand on her back, following her, closing in. She took a sharp turn down an alley, her heart racing as she searched for a way out. The alley was narrow, lined with dumpsters and fire escapes, but there was no exit, no way to escape. And then she heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing off the walls of the alleyway. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as she pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She held her breath, praying the operator would pick up. But before the call connected, the footsteps stopped. The alley fell silent. Lisa stood frozen, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her eyes wide with fear. She listened, straining to hear any sound, any sign that the man was still there. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement, just silence. Slowly, she turned, her breath catching in her throat as she scanned the alleyway. The man was gone. The alley was empty, but that didn't make sense. She hadn't heard him leave. There was no way he could have disappeared so quickly, so quietly. Her pulse quickened as she backed out of the alley, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. She hurried back onto the main street, her mind racing. He was playing with her, watching her. And now, he knew that she knew. Lisa didn't go home that night. Instead, she went to a friend's place, too scared to be alone. She spent the night on the couch, her phone clutched in her hand, waiting for the sound of footsteps outside the door. The next morning, she went to the police again. But there wasn't much they could do without more information. They told her to stay alert, to call if she saw him again. But Lisa knew better. Whoever he wasn't going to be caught so easily. He was a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The days dragged on, each one more suffocating than the last. Lisa stopped walking to work, opting for taxis instead, but it didn't help. She stopped going out at night, but even in the daylight, she felt his eyes on her. Then, one night, it happened. Lisa had been staying with her friend for nearly a week, but she couldn't hide forever. She had to return to her apartment, had to get her life back on track. She was careful, checking every corner, every shadow, but there was no sign of the man. She let out a sigh of relief as she locked the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment, trying to calm her racing heart. The apartment was dark and quiet, and for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it was over. But then, from the shadows of her apartment, she heard it. A soft, deliberate step. Lisa's breath caught in her throat, her blood running cold. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the darkened room, and that's when she saw him. The man was standing in the corner of her apartment, his hood still pulled low over his face, his body barely visible in the darkness. He had been waiting for her. Inside her apartment, Lisa's heart stopped. Her hand fumbled for the doorknob, but before she could make a move, the man took a step forward. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His presence was enough to paralyze her with fear. She backed away, her mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. And then, in the silence, he spoke. "You can't hide." His voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a jolt of terror through Lisa. She turned and ran for the bedroom, slamming the door behind her and locking it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she grabbed her phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. But before she could speak, before the operator could even answer, the line went dead. The lights in the apartment flickered once, twice. and then went out. And in the darkness, she heard the soft sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer and closer. Story 10. The Lurker in the Attic. When Cassie's grandmother passed away, she inherited her grandmother's old house. It had been in the family for generations, a sprawling, two-story Victorian house with creaky floors, high ceilings, and an attic that stretched over the entire second floor. The house was beautiful in its own way, though it had fallen into disrepair in recent years. Cassie had always loved visiting it as a child, but now, living there alone felt different. It had been a few months since she'd moved in, and at first, the house seemed like the perfect escape from her busy city life. It was quiet, tucked away at the end of a long, tree-lined road. But the more time she spent there, the more she noticed small, unsettling things. Doors she had closed would be open when she returned to her room. The faint sound of footsteps above her head when she knew she was alone. The attic, in particular, gave her an uneasy feeling. The attic door was in the hallway, just outside her bedroom, and it had always been difficult to open. The old wooden ladder that led up into the space was stiff with age, and Cassie hadn't ventured up there since she moved in. The thought of it sent a chill down her spine. Something about the darkness up there felt different from the rest of the house. Heavier. One night, after a particularly long day at work, Cassie was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when she heard it. A soft, slow creak. She froze, her eyes snapping open, and listened. The house was old. Creaks and groans were nothing new. But this sound was different. It wasn't the groan of the old wood settling. It was coming from directly above her. The attic. Cassie's heart pounded in her chest as the creaking continued, slow and deliberate, as if something, was moving around up there. It started in one corner of the attic and then moved, shifting across the ceiling above her bedroom, the floorboards groaning with every step. She lay still, too afraid to move, as the creaking stopped directly above her bed. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the ceiling, came a soft, rhythmic thump, like something tapping on the floor just above her head. Tap, tap, tap. Cassie's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to convince herself it was just the house settling, but deep down, she knew better. The sound was too purposeful, too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It was as though something, or someone, was waiting for her to respond. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone, the faint light of the screen casting long shadows across the room. She dialed her friend Lucy, who lived just a few blocks away. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited for her to pick up. "Hello?" Lucy's groggy voice answered. "Lucy," Cassie whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something in the attic." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean? You think someone's in your house?" "I don't know," Cassie said, her voice barely audible. "I can hear it, walking around up there, and it's tapping on the ceiling." Lucy's voice sharpened. "Get out of there, Cassie. Just get out of the house now." Cassie nodded, though Lucy couldn't see her. She threw back the covers and swung her legs over the side of the bed, her heart racing. She had to leave. She had to get out of the house now. But just as she stood up, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. The house felt too still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Cassie moved slowly toward the door, her eyes flicking up to the attic hatch. The old, wooden ladder was folded up inside, the trapdoor shut tight. But as she reached for the doorknob, she heard it. A soft, low creak, directly above her. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared up at the attic door, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. For a moment, everything was still. And then, the trapdoor began to open. It moved slowly, the old hinges groaning as it creaked open, just a few inches. The darkness inside the attic seemed to spill out into the hallway, thick and suffocating. Cassie stared, frozen in place, her mind racing with panic. Something moved in the shadows above. A faint rustle, like fabric brushing against the wooden floor. She couldn't see what it was, but she could feel it. Something was up there, lurking in the darkness, watching her. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. She had to leave. She had to get out of the house. Without thinking, she turned and ran down the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the silent house. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. The only thing she could hear was the sound of her own panicked breathing as she bolted out the front door and into the cool night air. She didn't stop running until she reached Lucy's house, her legs trembling, her heart still racing in her chest. She pounded on the door, gasping for breath, and Lucy opened it almost immediately, pulling her inside. "What happened?" Lucy asked, her eyes wide with concern. Cassie shook her head, unable to form the words. "The attic, it opened on its own. There's something in there, Lucy. Something's up there." Lucy grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the police. They arrived within minutes, but when they searched the house, they found nothing. The attic was empty, just a dusty old space filled with forgotten boxes and cobwebs. The trapdoor had been closed when they arrived, but Cassie knew what she had seen, what she had heard. There was something up there, something waiting. The next day, Cassie hired a locksmith to change the locks on every door and window in the house. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but no matter how hard she tried, the memory of that tapping sound haunted her. Tap, tap, tap. A week passed without incident, and Cassie began to relax, telling herself it had all been a bad dream. But the unease never fully left her. Every creak of the floorboards, every draft of wind through the old house made her skin prickle with fear. Then, one night, it happened again. Cassie was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when she heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened, holding her breath, hoping, praying that it was just her imagination. But the tapping continued. Slowly, she sat up, her eyes wide with fear as she looked up at the ceiling. The sound was coming from the attic again, louder this time, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. She stared up at the ceiling, paralyzed with fear, as the tapping grew louder, more urgent. And then, from the attic, came a voice. Soft, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. "Let me in." Cassie's blood ran cold. She stared at the ceiling, her heart racing, as the tapping continued. "Let me in," the voice whispered again, louder this time, more demanding. Cassie scrambled out of bed, her hands shaking as she grabbed her phone and dialed Lucy's number. Her fingers fumbled over the buttons, but before she could press the call button, the attic trapdoor creaked open again. The darkness seemed to spill out into the hallway once more, thick and suffocating. And then she saw it. A hand, long, pale, and skeletal, reached out from the attic, gripping the edge of the trapdoor. The fingers curled around the wood, the nails long and cracked. Cassie screamed, dropping her phone as she ran for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop to grab anything. She didn't look back. As she fled into the night, she could hear it, the soft tapping echoing behind her. Tap, tap, tap. The sound followed her, chasing her through the darkened streets, haunting her every step. Cassie never went back to the house. She couldn't. Whatever was in the attic was still there, waiting, and every night, as she lay in her new apartment, far from the house, she could still hear it. The soft tapping, the whispering voice. "Let me in." Story 11. The Shadow at the Window. Sarah had never believed in ghosts or the paranormal. She prided herself on being logical and rational, the kind of person who needed to see things to believe them. But when she moved into her new apartment, all of that changed. It was a small, cozy place on the top floor of an old building that had been converted into apartments. The rent was cheap, and the neighborhood was quiet, which suited Sarah just fine. The apartment had large, old-fashioned windows that let in plenty of sunlight during the day and offered a stunning view of the city. At night, however, the windows felt like portals into a different world, dark, reflective, and unsettling. It didn't take long for Sarah to notice the shadow. The first time she saw it, she was sitting on her couch, scrolling through her phone, when something caught her eye. It was a movement just outside the window. Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced up, expecting to see a bird or maybe a neighbor in the adjacent building. But what she saw was neither. There was a figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing just outside the window on the fire escape. It was tall and thin, with a vague, shadowy form that seemed to shift and blur at the edges. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at the figure, waiting for it to move, to reveal itself as a person, but it didn't. It just stood there, staring at her through the glass. Sarah blinked, and in that instant, the figure was gone. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by a tree or something else outside. She told herself she had imagined it, that it wasn't real. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching her. The next night, Sarah sat on her couch again, trying to focus on the TV, but her attention kept drifting to the window. She glanced at it every few minutes, expecting to see the shadow again, but the fire escape remained empty. It wasn't until she got up to go to bed that she saw it. This time, the figure was clearer, its outline sharper against the backdrop of the night sky. It was standing on the fire escape, closer now, just a few feet from the window. Sarah's heart raced as she stared at it, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure's head was tilted slightly, as if it were watching her, but there were no eyes, no face, just a dark, shifting void where its features should have been. She blinked again, and once more, the figure vanished. Sarah backed away from the window, her skin crawling with unease. She grabbed her phone and called her best friend, Rachel, hoping for some reassurance. "Hey, are you okay?" Rachel answered, her voice groggy from sleep. "There's something outside my window," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "What do you mean, something?" Rachel asked, her tone growing more concerned. "I don't know. It's just a shadow, but it's not like anything I've ever seen. It was there last night too, but it keeps disappearing." Rachel was silent for a moment. "Do you think it could be someone messing with you? Maybe a neighbor?" Sarah shook her head, even though Rachel couldn't see her. "I don't think so. It doesn't look like a person. It's just wrong. Maybe you should call the landlord. See if anyone else has seen anything." "I will," Sarah muttered, though she wasn't sure if the landlord could help with something like this. They talked for a while longer, with Rachel trying to calm her down, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. That night, she barely slept. Every creak of the building, every rustle of the wind outside made her jump, her heart pounding in her chest. She kept the curtains drawn tight, but that didn't help the feeling that the shadow was still out there, lurking just beyond the glass. The next morning, Sarah called her landlord and asked if anyone else had reported anything strange. The landlord, a gruff man named Mr. Owens, dismissed her concerns. "No one's complained about anything like that," he said, sounding annoyed. "Probably just shadows from the streetlights or a trick of the moonlight." Sarah wanted to believe that, but something inside her told her it wasn't true. As the days passed, the shadow outside her window became a regular presence. Some nights it was just a vague, distant figure, barely visible through the glass. Other nights, it was right up against the window, its form dark and looming, as though it was trying to get inside. Sarah tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it wasn't real, but the fear gnawed at her. She kept the curtains closed, but even then, she could feel it watching her. One night, After a particularly exhausting day at work, Sarah decided she couldn't take it anymore. She had to confront whatever was haunting her window. She sat on the couch, staring at the curtains, her heart racing with anticipation. Slowly, she reached out and pulled the curtains open. The figure was there, standing just outside the window. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had substance, depth. Its form was darker, more defined, and as Sarah stared at it, she realized with growing horror that it was moving. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging her, and then it took a step forward. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The fire escape was still there, but the figure wasn't standing on it anymore. It was floating just above it, its dark, shapeless body hovering in midair. Her heart raced as the figure pressed itself against the glass, its featureless face inches from the window. The glass fogged up slightly, as though the thing was breathing, if it could breathe. Suddenly, the lights in the apartment flickered. Sarah stumbled backward. Her eyes locked on the figure as the electricity sputtered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. Sarah gasped, her entire body trembling. She backed away from the window, her eyes wide with fear, but she couldn't bring herself to close the curtains again. She needed to see if it returned. For a long time, the window remained empty. The fire escape was just that, a cold, metal structure leading down into the alley below. But then, as Sarah began to relax, something changed. The room grew colder. The air felt heavy, thick, as though the walls themselves were pressing in on her. She could see her breath in the air, tiny puffs of fog in the freezing room. And then, slowly, she turned toward the window. The figure was back, but this time, it wasn't outside. It was standing inside the apartment. The shadow loomed just a few feet from her, taller than before, its dark form towering over her. It didn't move, didn't speak, but Sarah could feel its presence, cold, suffocating, and filled with malice. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away, her mind screaming at her to run. But before she could move, the lights flickered again. The shadow took a step closer. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled for the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the lock. The shadow was behind her, closing in, its presence overwhelming. The lights flickered once more, and the shadow reached for her. Sarah flung the door open and stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the cool night air hitting her face like a slap. She never went back to the apartment. She couldn't. Whatever had been haunting her window was no longer content to stay outside. It was inside now, and every night, when she closed her eyes, she could still feel it, lurking in the darkness, waiting for her. Story 12. The Creaking Floor. When Rob and Katie moved into their new home, they were thrilled. It was an old Victorian house in a quiet neighborhood, its tall windows and intricately carved wooden doors making it feel grand and full of history. The realtor had mentioned it needed a little work, but they didn't mind. They loved the character of old houses, the creaky floors, the high ceilings, the small details that gave the place personality. But it wasn't long before they realized that there was more to the house than just its charm. It started with the floorboards. On the first night, as they were unpacking boxes late into the evening, Rob noticed it. A soft creak, like someone walking slowly across the wooden floors, coming from the hallway just outside the living room. He glanced at Katie, but she hadn't seemed to notice. "It's an old house," he told himself, brushing it off. Wood settles, floors creak. It's normal. But the creaking continued. Every night, after they had gone to bed, Rob would hear it again. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps pacing the hallway just outside their bedroom. At first, he thought it was Katie getting up in the middle of the night, but when he asked her about it, she shook her head. "I thought that was you," she said, her brow furrowed. The uneasy feeling settled in Rob's stomach. The footsteps were too distinct to ignore. They were too steady, too deliberate, as though someone was pacing the house while they slept. One night, the sound woke him up again, louder this time, closer. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his heart pounding in his chest as the floorboards groaned under the weight of unseen footsteps. The sound grew louder, moving down the hallway, stopping just outside the bedroom door. Rob held his breath, straining to listen. The house was silent for a moment, as though whatever had been walking was waiting just on the other side of the door. Then, slowly, the creaking began again, this time moving away from the bedroom and down the stairs. The next morning, Rob searched the house, convinced that someone must have broken in, but there was no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been in the house. The doors and windows were all locked. Katie told him he was being paranoid, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The following night, the creaking returned, and this time, Katie heard it too. They were lying in bed when the familiar sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. Katie sat up, her eyes wide with fear as the floorboards groaned under the weight of unseen feet. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, clutching Rob's arm. Rob nodded, his heart racing. He could feel the tension in the air, the oppressive weight of something lurking just beyond the walls. "Stay here," he whispered, pulling on his robe as he slid out of bed. Katie grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there." But Rob shook his head. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to know what was causing the noise. He opened the bedroom door slowly, the hinges creaking as he peered into the dark hallway. It was empty, but the air felt colder, as though something had recently passed through. The soft groan of the floorboards sounded again, this time coming from downstairs. Rob took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway, the old wood creaking under his feet as he moved toward the stairs. The house was silent now, the only sound the distant hum of the wind outside. He descended the stairs, one slow step at a time, his ears straining to hear any sign of movement. The floorboards creaked beneath him, but the sound was different now, softer, as though something was walking beside him, just out of sight. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, his heart pounding in his chest as he scanned the dark living room. Everything was in its place. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the uneasy feeling that had settled in his gut wouldn't go away. Then, from behind him, he heard it, a soft, low creak. Rob turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he stared up the stairs. There, at the top of the staircase, was a shadow. It was faint, barely more than a dark shape in the dim light, but it was there, standing at the top of the stairs, watching him. The shadow was tall and thin, its body motionless, but Rob could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, pressing down on him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the shadow took a step forward, the floorboards groaning under its weight. Rob's heart pounded in his chest as the shadow descended the stairs, its movements slow and deliberate, each step accompanied by the soft creak of the wood beneath it. It was getting closer, its dark form growing more distinct as it neared the bottom of the stairs. He stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the shadow reached the last step. It stopped, standing just a few feet away from him, its head tilted slightly as though it were watching him. Rob's body froze in terror. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the shadow stepped closer. Its presence was overwhelming, filling the room with a cold, oppressive energy that made his skin crawl. And then, without warning, the shadow vanished. The house was silent again, the air still and cold. Rob stood there, trembling, his mind racing. He didn't know what he had just seen, but he knew one thing for certain. There was something in the house, something that had been walking the halls at night, watching them while they slept. When Rob told Katie what had happened, she didn't believe him at first. But the creaking continued, night after night, growing louder and more insistent. The footsteps became more frequent, pacing the house at all hours, sometimes stopping just outside their bedroom door. They tried everything, calling the landlord, checking the foundation of the house, even having the place blessed by a priest. But nothing worked. The creaking continued, and the shadow appeared more often, lurking in the corners of the house, watching them. One night, as they lay in bed, the creaking began again, louder this time, more frantic. The footsteps echoed through the house, moving quickly from room to room, as though the shadow was searching for something. Katie clutched Rob's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it looking for?" she whispered. Rob shook his head. "I don't know." The footsteps stopped outside their bedroom door, the floorboards groaning under the weight of something heavy. For a long moment, the house was silent. Then, slowly, the bedroom door began to creak open. Katie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the door swung open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. The shadow stood there, its tall, thin form barely visible in the darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching them. Rob felt a cold sweat break out across his skin as the shadow took a step into the room. He scrambled out of bed, his heart racing as he grabbed Katie's hand. "We have to go. Now." They bolted out of the bedroom, running down the stairs, the sound of creaking floorboards echoing behind them. The shadow followed, its footsteps heavy and deliberate as it pursued them through the house. They didn't stop running until they reached the front door, flinging it open and racing out into the night. The cold air hit them like a slap, but they didn't care. They ran down the street, not looking back until they were far from the house. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, Rob glanced back at the house. The shadow was standing in the window, watching them. They never returned to the house. Whatever was inside, whatever had been pacing the floors at night, was still there, waiting. And every night, as they lay awake in their new apartment, they could still hear it, the sound of creaking floorboards, slow and deliberate, as something walked through the house, searching. Story 13. The Face in the Woods. Every fall, a group of friends from the city would head out for a weekend camping trip, a tradition that had started back in college. They would hike, drink, tell stories around the campfire, and escape from the hustle of their everyday lives. This year, the group, Ryan, Sarah, Derek, and Jess, decided to venture deeper into the forest, choosing a remote spot none of them had ever been to before. It seemed perfect, isolated, quiet, miles away from the nearest town. They set up camp next to a small, tranquil lake, the trees towering around them, their leaves just starting to turn shades of red and orange. The first day was perfect, sunny, with just the right amount of chill in the air, and the evening brought a stunning sunset that reflected off the still waters of the lake. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the campsite, something changed. It started with a strange sound. The four friends were gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and laughing, when they heard it, a low, distant moan, echoing through the trees. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice low. Ryan shrugged. "Probably just the wind. We're deep in the woods. There are all kinds of weird noises out here." But Derek frowned, looking out into the trees. That didn't sound like the wind. They fell silent for a moment, listening. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the darkening sky, and the sound came again. This time closer, louder. It was like a long, mournful wail, as if someone, or something, was calling out from deep within the forest. "I don't like this," Jess muttered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "It's getting creepy out here." Ryan chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, it's probably just an animal or something. We're in the middle of the woods. It's normal." But as the night wore on, the uneasy feeling settled deeper into the group. The sound came and went, always distant but never too far away. They tried to ignore it, tried to laugh it off, but the laughter felt forced, strained. By the time they crawled into their tents, the sound had stopped altogether, leaving the woods eerily silent. But none of them could shake the feeling that something was out there, watching them. In the middle of the night, Sarah woke up suddenly, her heart pounding in her chest. At first, she wasn't sure what had woken her. Everything was quiet, the only sound the gentle rustling of the trees in the wind. But then she heard it, a soft rustling outside her tent, like something or someone moving through the underbrush. Her breath caught in her throat as she listened, her pulse quickening. The sound was faint, but it was getting closer. She lay still, every muscle tensed, straining to hear over the thudding of her heart. Then, from outside her tent, she heard a soft voice. Sarah. Her blood ran cold. She sat up slowly, her hands shaking as she unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer outside. The fire had long since died down, leaving the campsite in darkness, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, its body half hidden in the shadows. Its face was pale, almost glowing in the dim light, and its eyes, dark, hollow eyes, were fixed on her. Sarah, the voice called again, soft and raspy, but unmistakable. It knew her name. Her heart raced as she stared at the figure, unable to move, unable to breathe. The thing standing at the edge of the woods wasn't human. It couldn't be, but it was looking right at her. Suddenly, the figure took a step forward, its long arms reaching out toward her. Sarah gasped, stumbling backward, her hands fumbling with the tent zipper. She zipped it closed as fast as she could, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She could hear it now, footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving closer. Sarah. The voice was right outside her tent. She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she frantically texted the group chat. Sarah, guys, something's outside my tent. I think it's calling my name. For a moment, there was no response. Then her phone buzzed with a message from Derek. Derek, what? Are you sure? Sarah, I'm sure. It's right outside. I don't know what to do. Another buzz, this time from Jess. Jess, we're coming to you. Stay in the tent. Sarah's hands shook as she waited, listening to the soft rustling outside. The footsteps had stopped, but the presence, whatever it was, still lingered, just outside the thin fabric of the tent. A few agonizing minutes later, she heard Ryan and Derek's voices, calling her name as they approached her tent. Sarah? You okay? She unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out, her eyes wide with fear. Ryan and Derek were standing a few feet away, flashlights in hand, their faces pale and tense. Did you see it? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. See what? Ryan asked, scanning the trees with his flashlight. There was someone out there, Sarah said, pointing toward the spot where she had seen the figure. It was standing right there, and it knew my name. Derek frowned. We didn't see anyone. Maybe it was just your imagination, Ryan offered, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. But Sarah shook her head. No, it was real. I saw it. They stood there for a moment, the silence pressing in around them, the darkness feeling heavier than ever. Then Jess spoke up. Let's all sleep in the same tent tonight, just to be safe. They crowded into Sarah's tent, huddled together in the dark, trying to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still out there, watching them. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but none of them got much sleep. The next morning, they packed up their campsite as quickly as they could, eager to leave the woods behind. But as they were about to leave, Sarah stopped, her heart skipping a beat. On the ground, just outside her tent, were footprints. They were large and human, with long, clawed toes that dug deep into the soft earth. The prints led away from the campsite, disappearing into the woods. See? Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "I told you. Something was here." The group exchanged uneasy glances, the reality of what had happened sinking in. They didn't speak as they hiked back to the car, their eyes constantly scanning the trees, half expecting to see the figure again. As they loaded their gear into the car, Sarah glanced back at the woods one last time. For a moment, she thought she saw something, just a flicker of movement in the trees, a pale face watching from the shadows. But when she blinked, it was gone. They drove away in silence, the weight of the encounter hanging over them like a dark cloud. No one spoke about what had happened, but Sarah knew they were all thinking the same thing. Whatever had been in the woods that night hadn't been human, and it was still out there, waiting. Story 14. The Forgotten Room. When Leah and her fiancé, Matt, bought the old house, they thought they had stumbled upon the deal of a lifetime. It was a sprawling, two-story Victorian, with wraparound porches and a grand staircase that led to the upper floor. The place needed a little love, but they were excited to make it their own. What they didn't know was that the house had a secret hidden for decades, buried beneath layers of paint and wallpaper, forgotten by everyone who had lived there before them. It started on the third night. Leah had been exploring the house, getting to know every corner, every creaky floorboard. The upper floor had several bedrooms, but there was one that immediately felt off. It was smaller than the others, with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, and the air was noticeably colder in that room, even during the day. Still, Leah didn't think much of it at first. That night, after unpacking more boxes, she was walking down the upstairs hallway when she heard something. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint, coming from behind the walls, like the sound of someone gently knocking. She paused, listening, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. "Probably just the pipes," she told herself, brushing it off. The next night, it happened again. Soft, steady tapping, coming from the same spot. Leah mentioned it to Matt, who shrugged. "It's an old house," he said. "It's probably just settling." But Leah wasn't convinced. Something about the sound felt deliberate. A few days later, as they were stripping the wallpaper in the strange, cold room upstairs, Leah noticed something odd. The wallpaper didn't match the other rooms. It had been added more recently, as if someone had covered something up. Curious, she began to peel it away, her fingers working carefully at the edges. As she tore the paper off the wall, she noticed something strange underneath. Small, square shapes, barely visible beneath the paint. "What's that?" Matt asked, stepping closer. Leah peeled more of the wallpaper away, revealing a series of small, square holes about the size of bricks that had been covered up. "Is this a window?" she asked, frowning. Matt stepped back, looking puzzled. Why would anyone cover up a window? They worked together, removing the rest of the wallpaper and uncovering what appeared to be the outline of a door, long sealed shut. The door frame was still visible beneath layers of plaster, hidden as if someone had tried to erase it from the house entirely. Matt stepped back, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is weird." Leah's curiosity was piqued. "We have to open it." Matt hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe there's a reason it was sealed off." But Leah couldn't let it go. She grabbed a hammer and began chipping away at the plaster. The more she uncovered, the clearer the door became. Finally, after what felt like hours of work, the hidden door was fully revealed. It was old, the wood warped and darkened with age, and the handle was cold to the touch. Leah paused, her heart pounding in her chest. "Are you sure about this?" Matt asked. Leah nodded, gripping the handle. With a deep breath, she twisted it, the door creaking as it slowly swung open. Beyond the door was a small, narrow hallway, barely wide enough for one person to walk through. The air that seeped out was stale, heavy with the smell of dust and decay. Leah shined her flashlight into the darkness, revealing the outline of another door at the far end of the hallway. They exchanged uneasy glances. "Let's see what's in there," Leah said, her voice steadier than she felt. They made their way down the narrow hall, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. When they reached the second door, Leah reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. It opened with a low groan, revealing a room that hadn't been touched in decades. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with broken furniture and forgotten toys. A small bed, its metal frame rusted, stood against one wall, and in the corner was a child's rocking horse, its paint chipped and faded. Leah's breath caught in her throat. Why would someone seal this off? Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. Leah didn't have an answer. The room felt wrong, like it had been frozen in time, untouched by the outside world. The air was thick with a sense of abandonment, as if whoever had once lived there had been forgotten. As they explored the room, Leah's flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. Her gaze fell on the far corner of the room, where a small, old-fashioned dresser stood. There was something strange about it. She approached it slowly, her heart racing. The dresser's top drawer was slightly ajar, and when she opened it, she found a collection of dusty, old photographs. They were black and white, faded with time, showing a family that looked like they had lived in the house years ago. There was a mother, a father, and a small boy, no older than 6 or 7. They looked happy, smiling for the camera, but there was something off about the boy. His face was slightly blurred, as if he hadn't been standing still when the picture was taken. Leah's fingers brushed over the photos, but as she lifted the last one, her blood ran cold. In the background of the photograph, barely visible, was a figure standing in the shadows, a tall, thin figure with dark, hollow eyes. "Matt," Leah whispered, showing him the photo. Matt's face paled as he looked at it, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Suddenly, the air in the room grew colder, and the soft, rhythmic tapping sound echoed through the walls again. Louder this time, more insistent. Leah and Matt exchanged terrified glances. "Let's get out of here," Matt said, his voice trembling. They turned to leave, but just as they reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. Leah gasped, her heart pounding as she grabbed the handle and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. "Matt, help me," she cried, pulling on the door with all her strength. Matt rushed to her side, yanking on the handle, but it was stuck fast. The tapping sound grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to break through the walls. And then, from the far corner of the room, they heard it. A soft, childlike whisper. "Let me out." Leah froze, her blood running cold. She turned slowly, her flashlight flickering as it illuminated the far corner of the room. The rocking horse was moving. It rocked slowly back and forth, its creaky rhythm matching the tapping sound in the walls. "Let me out," the voice whispered again, louder this time. Leah and Matt backed away, their hearts racing, as the temperature in the room plummeted. The air grew thick with an oppressive energy, and the shadows in the corners seemed to shift and writhe. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, from the darkness, the voice spoke again. "Why did you forget me?" Leah's breath caught in her throat as the room seemed to close in around them. The shadows shifted, and for a brief, horrifying moment, she saw him. The boy from the photographs, standing in the corner, his eyes dark and hollow, his face twisted into a look of pure anguish. The door behind them flew open, and without a second thought, they bolted from the room, racing down the narrow hallway and slamming the hidden door shut behind them. They never spoke about what had happened in that room. They sealed the door again, covering it with wallpaper, pretending it didn't exist. But every night, as Leah lay in bed, she could still hear it, the soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the walls. And sometimes, when the house was quiet, she could hear the whisper, "Why did you forget me?" Story 16. The Whispering Dolls. Lila had always been drawn to antique shops. She loved sifting through old trinkets, discovering the stories behind forgotten items. When she came across the small, dusty shop on the edge of town, she couldn't resist going inside. The place was cluttered with old furniture, strange paintings, and shelves filled with fragile, worn-down objects from long ago. As Lila wandered through the aisles, something caught her eye: a row of porcelain dolls sitting on a high shelf at the back of the store. There were 4 of them, each dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their delicate faces painted with eerie precision. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow her as she moved closer. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with thin, gray hair, noticed her interest. "Ah, those," she said, her voice low and raspy. "They're very old. Been in my family for generations." "They're beautiful," Lila said, though there was something unsettling about them, something about the way they seemed to stare. "They are," the woman agreed, though there was no warmth in her voice. "But they come with a story and a warning." Lila raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What kind of warning?" The shopkeeper's eyes narrowed. "The dolls, they whisper." Lila chuckled nervously. "What do you mean?" The woman leaned closer, her expression deadly serious. "At night, when the house is quiet, you can hear them whispering. They say things that you shouldn't listen to." Lila felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't believe in that sort of thing: ghosts, curses, haunted dolls. But the woman's words left an uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach. Still, she couldn't resist the strange allure of the dolls. Something about them called to her. She decided to buy one, the smallest doll, with bright blue eyes and golden curls. As she paid for it, the shopkeeper gave her one last warning: "Keep her in the light. And whatever you do, don't listen to her whispers." Lila left the shop with a smile, but the woman's words lingered in her mind. That night, she placed the doll on her dresser, its glass eyes glinting in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. It looked innocent enough, just a pretty little relic from another time. She laughed at herself for feeling uneasy, shaking off the old woman's warning. As the night went on, Lila tried to sleep, but she kept waking up. She wasn't sure why. There was no noise, no strange dreams, just an odd feeling of being watched. Each time she opened her eyes, the doll was there, sitting quietly on the dresser, its painted face turned toward her. It wasn't until around 3 a.m. that she heard it: a faint, soft whisper, like someone muttering under their breath. Lila froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened, straining to hear. "Listen." Her eyes darted to the doll. It hadn't moved, but the whisper seemed to come from its direction. She sat up in bed, her body tense with fear. "Come closer." Lila's breath caught in her throat. The whisper was so quiet, so faint, but it was unmistakable. It was coming from the doll. She quickly turned on the lamp, flooding the room with light. The whispering stopped instantly. The doll sat there, as still as ever, its eyes fixed on her. Her hands shook as she grabbed the doll, stuffing it into the drawer of her dresser, out of sight. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. It had to be her imagination. Dolls didn't whisper. They couldn't. But as she lay back down, the unease crept back into her mind. The shopkeeper had warned her about this. She had said the doll would whisper at night, but Lila hadn't believed her. Now, she wasn't so sure. The next day, Lila decided to leave the doll in the drawer. She didn't want to deal with it again. She convinced herself that it had all been a bad dream, a trick of her overtired mind. But that night, just as she was drifting off to sleep, the whispering started again. "Let me out." Lila's eyes flew open. The drawer was closed. There was no way she could hear anything from inside it. But the whisper was clearer now, more insistent. "Let me out." She sat up, her heart pounding. The whisper seemed to come from all around her, echoing through the room, but it was soft, almost coaxing. Listen to me. Lila's pulse quickened. She threw off the covers and rushed to the dresser, yanking the drawer open. The doll lay there, its glass eyes staring up at her, its porcelain face blank and innocent. The whispering stopped. Her hands shook as she grabbed the doll and placed it back on the dresser, her mind racing. What was happening? Was she losing her mind? As the night wore on, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was watching her, waiting for her to fall asleep. She tried to ignore it, but every time she closed her eyes, she felt its presence, its cold, glassy eyes burning into her. By the third night, the whispering grew louder. Closer, come closer. It was no longer a faint, distant sound. It filled the room, wrapping around her like a cold fog. The doll sat on the dresser, unmoving, but the voice, it was undeniable now. The doll was speaking. Listen to me. Let me in. Lila sat up in bed, her hands clutching the blankets. She couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed the doll, its body cold and rigid in her hands, and stormed downstairs to the kitchen. Without thinking, she threw the doll into the trash can, slamming the lid down. She stood there, breathless, her heart racing. It was just a doll. It couldn't hurt her, but deep down, she wasn't sure. That night, the whispering didn't stop. Let me out, let me out. Lila woke with a start, her skin crawling with fear. The voice was louder than ever, more desperate. She could hear it clearly now, coming from downstairs, from the kitchen. The doll was calling to her. Let me out. She tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets over her head, but the voice wouldn't stop. Let me out, let me in. It was relentless, echoing through her mind, louder and louder until it was all she could hear. Let me in. Lila jumped out of bed, her hands shaking as she ran down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as she approached the kitchen. The trash can rattled as if something was trying to break free from inside. Without thinking, she yanked the trash can open, her breath catching in her throat. The doll was gone. The kitchen was silent now, the whispering replaced by a cold, suffocating stillness. Lila's heart raced as she searched the house, but the doll was nowhere to be found. It had simply vanished. She spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, wide awake, waiting for the whispering to return. But it never did. In the days that followed, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was still with her, hiding somewhere in the house, waiting for the right moment to return. She searched every corner, every drawer, but the doll was gone, as if it had never existed. But late at night, when the house was quiet, she could still hear it, the soft, familiar whisper. Let me in. And she knew, deep down, that the doll wasn't finished with her. Story 17. The Man in the Wall. Ben and Carla had been looking for a fresh start. Their small, cramped apartment in the city had become too stifling, and the quiet life in the country was calling to them. So when they found the old farmhouse for sale, sitting alone at the edge of a thick forest, it seemed perfect. It was far enough from town to give them the peace they craved, but not so far that they couldn't get to the grocery store or the occasional diner. The house had been abandoned for a few years, the realtor explained. The previous owners had moved out suddenly, leaving the place fully furnished, as if they planned to return but never did. Despite its worn-down appearance, Ben and Carla fell in love with the place. Its wide-open rooms, the overgrown garden waiting to be restored, and the fireplace that would crackle warmly in the winter. They moved in on a cool autumn day, excited about their new beginning. As they unpacked boxes and rearranged furniture, Carla noticed something odd. "Do you hear that?" she asked Ben, pausing as she stacked books on the old wooden shelf. Ben looked up from where he was fixing a chair. "Hear what?" "It's like knocking." Ben listened for a moment, but all he heard was the wind rustling through the trees outside. Probably just the house settling. Its old, creaky floors, drafty walls. Carla nodded, brushing it off, though the faint sound lingered in the back of her mind. She told herself Ben was right. Old houses made noises. There was nothing to worry about. But that night, as they lay in bed, the noise returned. Carla woke up suddenly, her heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. She held her breath, listening. The house was silent. Then, from the wall behind the bed, she heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Carla sat up, her pulse quickening. She turned toward Ben, who was still fast asleep beside her. The tapping continued, growing louder, as if someone, or something, was inside the wall, knocking to get out. She shook Ben awake. "Do you hear that?" Ben groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What?" "Listen." They sat in silence for a moment. The tapping had stopped. Ben sighed, shaking his head. "You're just imagining things. It's probably the pipes." Carla frowned but didn't argue. She lay back down, trying to convince herself that he was right. But deep down, something about the sound bothered her. Something about the rhythm, the way it had seemed so deliberate. The next few days were quiet. Carla pushed the tapping to the back of her mind, busying herself with fixing up the house, repainting the walls, and cleaning the dust-covered furniture. But the sense of unease lingered. Then, on the fourth night, the tapping returned. It started softly, barely audible, like a distant knock at the door. Carla tried to ignore it, but as the night wore on, the sound grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it didn't stop. Carla sat up in bed, her heart racing as she stared at the wall. The sound was coming from the same spot as before, behind the headboard. She grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight, and shined it on the wall. Nothing, but the tapping continued. She reached out, her hand trembling as she pressed her palm against the wall. The wood felt cold beneath her fingers, and for a moment, she thought she felt something, a vibration, as if someone were knocking on the other side. Her breath caught in her throat as a thought crept into her mind, unbidden. What if there was someone inside the wall? The thought was ridiculous, impossible. But as the tapping grew louder, more frantic, she couldn't shake the image of someone, or something, trapped inside, desperately trying to get out. Carla woke Ben again, her voice shaking. "It's back. The tapping. There's something in the wall." Ben groaned, sitting up and rubbing his face. "Carla, there's nothing in the wall. I'm telling you, it's not the pipes. It's coming from inside." Ben sighed, but this time he got up, grabbing a hammer from the toolbox by the door. "Fine, let's check it out." They moved the bed aside, exposing the wall. The tapping had stopped again, leaving the room in an eerie silence. Ben ran his hand along the wood, feeling for any signs of damage or hollow spots. "See? There's nothing." Tap, tap, tap. Ben froze. The sound came again, louder this time, just inches from where he stood. His face paled. "Okay, that's weird." Without another word, Ben raised the hammer and struck the wall. The plaster crumbled easily, and within moments, they had opened a hole big enough to peer inside. What they found wasn't what either of them expected. Inside the wall was a small, dark cavity, and in that space, there was something wrapped in an old, rotting blanket. Carla's stomach twisted as Ben reached in, pulling the bundle out into the light. The smell of decay filled the room, and Carla covered her mouth, gagging. As Ben unwrapped the blanket, something tumbled out and hit the floor with a soft thud. A skull. The blanket fell away, revealing the rest of the bones, small, brittle, and long decayed. A child's bones. Carla stumbled backward, her heart racing. "Oh my God." Ben's hands trembled as he set the blanket down, staring at the remains. How long has this been here?" Carla couldn't speak. The sight of the tiny skeleton filled her with a deep, overwhelming dread. The tapping. It had come from this child. But how? They called the police, and within hours, the house was swarming with investigators. The bones were taken away, and an officer questioned them, though they had no answers to give. They didn't know how long the body had been in the wall, or how it had gotten there. That night, after the police left, the house felt colder, emptier. Carla couldn't stop thinking about the child. How long had they been trapped in the wall? How had they died? And why had no one ever found them? But the worst part was the tapping. It didn't stop. Despite the hole in the wall, despite the removal of the remains, the tapping continued. Every night, just after midnight, it would start again. Soft, rhythmic, insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Carla tried to ignore it, tried to tell herself that it was just her imagination. But as the nights wore on, the tapping grew louder, more persistent. It followed her, echoing through the house, no matter where she went. And then, one night, it changed. The tapping was no longer coming from the wall. It was coming from the floor. Carla woke up in a cold sweat, her heart racing as she listened to the sound. It was softer this time, but unmistakable. Something was knocking from beneath the floorboards. She climbed out of bed, her hands trembling as she crouched down and pressed her ear to the floor. The tapping was clear, deliberate. And then she heard it, a voice. Faint, muffled, but unmistakable. "Let me out." Carla shot to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was soft, childlike, full of fear and desperation. "Let me out." The words sent a chill down her spine. She backed away from the bed, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. But the tapping didn't stop, and neither did the voice. Carla ran to Ben, shaking him awake, her voice trembling. "Ben, Ben, it's happening again. The tapping, it's coming from the floor." Ben sat up, his face pale. He listened, his eyes wide with fear as the tapping echoed through the room, followed by the faint, desperate voice. "Let me out." They stared at each other, both too terrified to move. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if something, or someone, was trying to break free from beneath the floorboards. "Let me out." Carla couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed Ben's arm, pulling him toward the door. "We have to leave. We can't stay here." They fled the house that night, never looking back. The next morning, they packed their things and left for good. But even as they drove away, Carla could still hear it, the soft, desperate tapping, following them through the cold, empty halls of the house. And late at night, when the world was quiet, she could still hear the voice, whispering in the back of her mind, "Let me out." Story 18. The Screaming Well. There was a well deep in the woods, a place few people in the nearby town dared to visit. Locals called it the Screaming Well, a name passed down through generations. The stories varied, but they all shared the same grim warning. Those who ventured too close to the well often heard something that sounded like a person in desperate need of help, screaming, pleading. But no one had ever found anyone down there. Claire had always been curious about the well. She'd grown up hearing the stories, mostly from kids trying to scare each other, but she had always dismissed them. She didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or haunted places. It was just an old well, forgotten by time, slowly crumbling as nature reclaimed the land around it. But one autumn afternoon, when her friend Josh suggested they go check it out, Claire hesitated. She was never one to back down from a challenge, and Josh loved teasing her about her skepticism. It was a clear day, and the woods were beautiful, full of warm colors as the leaves turned golden and red. The well, Josh said, was only a mile into the forest, just off the main trail. "Come on," he said with a grin. "It's just an old well. What's the worst that could happen?" Claire rolled her eyes, but the curiosity was too strong. She agreed, and they set off, backpacks full of snacks and water bottles, laughing as they hiked deeper into the woods. The forest grew denser the farther they went, the trees twisting together overhead, blocking out most of the light. The trail became rougher, less traveled, and soon they had to climb over fallen logs and push through thick bushes. Eventually, they came to a clearing, and there, in the center, stood the well. It was old, very old, made of moss-covered stone, its edges worn smooth from centuries of rain and wind. The circular stone wall stood about 3 feet high, and the well itself was dark, its depths hidden by shadow. No rope or bucket hung from the rotting wooden frame above it, and the air around it felt cooler, heavier. "Well, here it is," Josh said, his voice quieter now, the teasing tone gone. Claire stared at it, feeling a sudden chill run down her spine. There was something about the well, something she couldn't explain. It felt wrong, like the air itself had changed, thickened with something unseen. "You think it's haunted?" Josh asked, half smiling but his voice strained. Claire forced a laugh, shaking off the unease. "Of course not. It's just a well." But as she stepped closer, peering over the edge, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the stories pressing down on her. The inside of the well was dark, impossibly dark, as if the light couldn't reach the bottom. She couldn't see how deep it went, but when she dropped a small rock down, the sound of it hitting the water echoed up after what felt like too long a pause. Josh leaned over the edge, whistling. "That's deep. Think anyone's actually fallen in?" Claire shrugged. "Probably not." But as she spoke, a soft sound rose from the depths of the well. It was so faint at first that she thought she had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. A voice. "Help me." Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at Josh, expecting him to be laughing, ready to claim it was a prank, but he wasn't. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with confusion. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Claire nodded, her heart racing. She stepped back from the well, her pulse quickening. The voice came again, clearer now. It was distant, echoing up from the darkness. "Please help me." Josh's eyes darted toward the well. "Is someone down there?" "I don't know," Claire said, her voice shaking. "It doesn't make sense. No one should be down there." They stood there, frozen, as the voice grew louder, more desperate. "Help me, please." Josh took a step closer to the well, peering down into the dark. "Hey," he called, his voice shaky. "Are you okay? We'll get help." But there was no response, just the soft sound of the wind rustling through the trees. "Josh, let's go," Claire whispered, fear gripping her chest. Something's wrong. But Josh didn't move. He was staring down into the well, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. "It doesn't make sense. Who's down there?" Suddenly, the voice changed. It was no longer pleading. It was angry. "You can't leave me. Don't leave me." The words echoed up from the depths, louder now, a scream of rage and pain. The sound seemed to fill the clearing, reverberating off the trees, growing louder and louder until it was all Claire could hear. Josh stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. "We have to go," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Claire grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the well. They turned and ran, their footsteps pounding against the dirt as the voice chased them, growing louder with each step. "Don't leave me. Don't leave me." The sound of the voice seemed to follow them through the forest, even as they put more distance between themselves and the well. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps as they ran, dodging branches and leaping over fallen trees. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the edge of the forest, the town visible in the distance. The voice had faded, replaced by the normal sounds of the woods. Birds, rustling leaves, the distant hum of cars on the road. They stopped, both of them bent over, gasping for breath. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Josh straightened up, his face pale. What was that? Claire shook her head, still trembling. I don't know, but it wasn't human. The ride home was silent, both of them too shaken to speak. That night, Claire lay in bed, her mind racing, replaying the events over and over. She couldn't get the voice out of her head, the way it had shifted from pleading to angry, the way it had echoed in her bones. The next day, Josh called. His voice was tense, his words hurried. Claire, something's wrong? What do you mean? She asked, her stomach twisting with dread. I think I can still hear it. The voice. Claire's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Josh's voice cracked. I hear it. In my house. I woke up last night and I could hear it, whispering. From the walls. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. Josh, that's impossible. We're miles away from the well. I know, but I swear it's here, Claire. I'm not imagining it. I hear it. It's getting louder. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay awake in the dark, listening to the silence of her room, her mind racing with fear. And then, just past midnight, she heard it. A soft whisper. Help me. Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen with fear. The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was there, coming from somewhere deep within the house, like a distant echo carried on the wind. Claire's hands shook as she sat up, straining to hear. The voice grew louder, more insistent, filling the quiet of the night. Help me. It was the same voice from the well. Claire's heart raced as she grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed Josh's number. But before she could press call, the voice came again, louder now. Don't leave me. Her blood ran cold. The voice was coming from behind her. Slowly, she turned, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows in the room seemed to move, twisting and shifting in the dim light. And then, in the corner of the room, she saw it. A figure. It was barely visible, more of a shadow than a person, but Claire could see the faint outline of a face, twisted in pain, its mouth open in a silent scream. The voice echoed in her mind, louder now, filling the room with its desperate plea. Help me. Don't leave me. Claire stumbled back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She ran out of the house, not stopping until she was outside in the cold night air, her heart racing, her body trembling. She didn't know what she had brought back from the well, but one thing was certain. It wasn't going to let her go. And every night, when the house was quiet, she could still hear it, the voice, growing louder, more insistent, whispering from the walls. It was waiting for her to return. Story 19. The Shattered Reflection. It started with a crack in the mirror. Emily had lived in her grandmother's house for almost a year now. The old, creaky Victorian home had been passed down through the family, and when Emily inherited it, she couldn't believe her luck. It was beautiful in its old-fashioned way. Tall ceilings, dark wood floors, and thick drapes that seemed to trap the house in perpetual twilight. The house had character, as her grandmother always said, but it also had its fair share of oddities. One of the strangest things in the house was the large, antique mirror that hung in the upstairs hallway. The mirror had always been there, as long as Emily could remember, and it was her grandmother's most prized possession. It had a beautiful, ornate gold frame, but the glass itself had started to show its age. Small imperfections, dark spots where the silver backing had faded, and a slight warping at the edges. One evening, while Emily was walking down the hallway, she noticed a crack running across the surface of the mirror. It was small, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but it was there. A thin, jagged line, like a spider's web etched into the glass. She frowned, tracing the crack with her finger. She didn't remember seeing it before. Maybe the house had settled, causing the mirror to shift, or maybe something had hit it without her noticing. Either way, it bothered her. The mirror had been in the family for generations, and seeing it damaged filled her with a strange sense of unease. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind fixating on the crack in the mirror. It felt wrong, somehow, like a flaw that shouldn't be there. Finally, she gave up on trying to sleep and made her way to the kitchen for a glass of water. As she passed the mirror in the hallway, she paused. In the dim light, she noticed something strange. Her reflection was off. It was subtle, but there was something not quite right about it. She leaned closer, studying her reflection, and that's when she realized her reflection wasn't moving. Emily stood perfectly still, her heart racing as she stared at herself in the glass. The reflection was identical to her, same dark hair, same tired eyes, but it wasn't following her movements. It just stood there, frozen, staring back at her with an expression that didn't quite match her own. A chill ran down her spine. She took a step back, her breath catching in her throat, and the reflection finally moved. But it didn't mirror her movement exactly. It was slower, more deliberate, like it was deciding whether or not to follow her. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the mirror, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't know what she had just seen, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The next morning, she tried to convince herself it had been a trick of the light, that she was overtired and imagining things. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of her mind. She avoided the hallway as much as possible, taking a different route through the house to avoid the mirror altogether. But the more she tried to avoid it, the more it seemed to call to her. Every time she passed by the hallway, she could feel the mirror's presence, like it was watching her, waiting for her to look at it again. A few days later, Emily decided to cover the mirror. She found an old sheet and draped it over the glass, hoping that would help put her mind at ease. But even with the mirror covered, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, the dream started. In the first dream, Emily was standing in the hallway, staring at the mirror. The sheet had fallen away, revealing the cracked glass beneath. As she moved closer, she saw her reflection again. Only this time, it wasn't just her reflection. There was someone else standing behind her. A shadowy figure, just barely visible, lurking in the background, watching her with dark, hollow eyes. Emily woke with a start, her heart racing, her body drenched in sweat. She sat up in bed, gasping for breath. The image of the figure burned into her mind. For the next few nights, the dreams came back, each one more vivid, more terrifying than the last. In every dream, she would see the same figure, standing just behind her reflection, its presence growing stronger, more oppressive. It never moved, never spoke, but its eyes, those dark, empty eyes, followed her everywhere she went. Then, one night, the dreams stopped. Emily woke up in the middle of the night, her mind strangely calm. She got out of bed and, without really thinking about it, made her way to the hallway. The house was quiet, the air heavy with a stillness that felt almost suffocating. She stood in front of the mirror, the sheet still covering it, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what she had to do, even though every instinct told her not to. Slowly, she reached out and pulled the sheet away. The mirror was exactly as she had left it, the same crack running across the glass, the same imperfections that had always been there. But when she looked at her reflection, she saw it. The figure was standing behind her, closer than ever. Its dark, hollow eyes stared at her through the glass, its twisted, shadowy form barely visible in the dim light. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to look away. And then, the reflection smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile, spreading across her reflection's face in a way that made her skin crawl. Emily backed away, her heart racing, but her reflection didn't follow. It stayed perfectly still, watching her, smiling that terrible, twisted smile. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway flickered, and for a brief moment, the figure in the mirror stepped forward. Emily screamed, stumbling backward as the figure reached out, its hand pressing against the inside of the glass. The mirror cracked further, the sound echoing through the hallway as the figure pressed harder, its twisted form becoming more distinct. "Let me out," it whispered, its voice low and raspy. Emily's body trembled with fear as she turned and ran, fleeing down the hallway, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the cold night air hitting her face like a slap. She never went back into the house. The next day, Emily called a friend and told them everything. Together, they returned to the house and removed the mirror from the wall, wrapping it in thick blankets and placing it in the attic, out of sight. But even with the mirror gone, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. Every time she caught her reflection in a window or a puddle of water, she expected to see that twisted smile staring back at her. And every night, as she lay in bed, she could still hear it, the faint, distant whisper, echoing in her mind. "Let me out." Story 21. The Dark Corner. Lucas had just moved into his new apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest one-bedroom on the 4th floor of an old building downtown. It was cheap, and it suited him fine. He liked the high ceilings, the large windows, and the vintage charm that came with creaky floorboards and flickering lights. He had only been living there for a week when he noticed it, the dark corner. It was in the living room, a small, shadowed space where the light never seemed to reach. No matter how bright the day was or how many lamps Lucas switched on, that corner remained in shadow, untouched by light. At first, he didn't pay much attention to it. Every place had its quirks, and the apartment was old. He assumed it was just an odd lighting issue or a draft making the shadows move. But as the days went on, Lucas became increasingly aware of it. The dark corner didn't just feel like a shadow. It felt like something was there, hiding, watching him. He would catch himself glancing at it, waiting for some movement that never came. At night, as he sat on the couch watching TV, he couldn't help but feel as though something in that corner was watching him back. One evening, as he was reading a book, the power went out. The apartment plunged into darkness, and the usual streetlights that filtered through the windows seemed dimmer than usual. The dark corner, now even darker, seemed to expand, its shadows stretching across the room. Lucas lit a few candles, placing them around the living room to bring some light back into the space. But even in the flickering glow of the candles, the dark corner remained untouched. It was as though the darkness there was alive, swallowing the light, refusing to be illuminated. He tried to shake off the creeping dread that had settled over him, telling himself he was just being paranoid. It was just a shadow. There was nothing there. But then, out of the silence came a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible shuffle, like the sound of something moving across the floor. Lucas froze, his heart skipping a beat as he strained to listen. The sound came again, this time louder, a slow, deliberate scraping noise, as though something heavy was being dragged across the wood. The sound was coming from the dark corner. Lucas' blood ran cold. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the corner, his eyes wide with fear. The darkness there seemed to shift, twisting and writhing like something was moving within it. He grabbed his phone, turning on the flashlight, and aimed it directly at the corner. The beam of light cut through the room, illuminating everything in its path. Everything except the corner. The darkness there remained, untouched by the light, as though the shadows were absorbing it. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to get closer, to see what was hiding there, but his legs refused to move. Something inside him screamed that whatever was in that corner wasn't meant to be seen. The scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, as though something, or someone, was trying to claw its way out of the shadows. Lucas's heart raced as he stumbled backward, his hands shaking as he tried to keep the flashlight steady. Suddenly, the sound stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, the only sound the faint hum of the candles flickering in the distance. Lucas stared at the dark corner, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, from the darkness, came a whisper. "Come closer." Lucas' breath caught in his throat. The voice was soft, almost inviting, but there was something sinister lurking beneath it. He took a step back, shaking his head, his pulse quickening. "Come closer," the voice repeated, a little louder this time, more insistent. His legs trembled, his entire body on edge, as he felt an overwhelming urge to step toward the darkness. But every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay away. "No," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. He backed away further, his phone still aimed at the corner, though the flashlight did nothing to pierce the impenetrable blackness. The voice came again, now twisted and angry. "Don't turn away." A cold wave of dread washed over him, and for a brief, horrifying moment, he saw it. Something moving in the darkness. It was quick, barely more than a flicker of motion, but Lucas could see the outline of a figure. Tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its face hidden in the shadows. Lucas stumbled backward, his heart racing as the figure in the corner seemed to grow larger, darker, more defined. The shadows twisted and writhed, as though the figure were trying to pull itself free from the darkness. "Look at me," the voice hissed, low and menacing. Lucas didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, bolting out of the apartment and into the hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands shook as he fumbled for his keys, locking the door behind him. For the next few hours, he sat in his car, trying to calm himself down, trying to convince himself it was all in his head. He told himself it was just a trick of the light, that the shadows were playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew better. The next morning, after a sleepless night, Lucas went back into the apartment. He expected the dark corner to be gone, for the sunlight streaming through the windows to have erased whatever lingering terror had gripped him the night before. But the corner was still dark. No matter how much light filled the room, that small patch of shadow remained, a dark spot that refused to be illuminated. Over the next few days, the presence in the corner grew stronger. Lucas could feel it watching him, following him with unseen eyes. The whispers returned, faint at first, but soon louder, more demanding. "Look at me. Come closer." He tried to ignore it, tried to pretend it wasn't there, but it was impossible. Every time he turned his back, the whispers would start again, tugging at his mind, urging him to give in. At night, he would wake up to the sound of scraping, as though something was moving through the apartment, dragging itself closer to him. And then, one night, the scratching stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. It was oppressive, filling the apartment with a sense of impending dread. Lucas lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next sound, the next whisper. But the apartment was silent. Slowly, he sat up, his breath shaky, his body tense with fear. He didn't want to look, didn't want to know what was happening in the living room. But he had to. Something inside him was pulling him toward it, urging him to see what had become of the dark corner. He grabbed his phone, the dim glow of the screen barely illuminating the hallway as he made his way to the living room. His heart raced, his hands trembling as he stepped closer to the corner. When he reached the living room, he froze. The dark corner was gone. In its place, there was nothing but empty space, illuminated by the glow of the streetlights outside. The shadows had vanished. For a moment, Lucas felt a wave of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe the darkness had left. But then he noticed something else. There, in the center of the room, was a figure. It stood motionless, its tall, thin body silhouetted against the faint light. Its head was tilted slightly, its arms hanging limply at its sides. Lucas's breath caught in his throat as he stared at it, his mind racing. The figure took a step forward. Lucas stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the figure took another step toward him, its shadowy form growing clearer with every step. And then, in the darkness, it spoke. "You can't hide from me," Lucas screamed.